What lies beneath the grass and memory of a small corner of the Netherlands, hidden for decades beneath what looks like an ordinary patchwork of fields and tree lines? The answer to that question shaped one of the largest airborne operations in human history, and changed the course of a war in ways that no one, not the planners, not the commanders, not even the soldiers themselves, quite expected. There is a particular quality to the dawn in the Dutch countryside near Arnhem. The Rhine, flows broad and grey through the landscape here, and in the early morning hours, before the sun breaks clear, the river valleys fill with mist. This mist moves slowly, neither rushing nor quite still, pooling in the depressions where the land dips toward water, clinging to the edges of woods that have stood for centuries. If you were to walk through these fields on such a dawn, past the modern farms and the quiet roads, past the memorials and the restored houses, you would feel the weight of the air itself, damp and cool, and somehow heavy with what it once contained. 80 years ago, that same mist rose over something entirely different. Beneath the trees that line the Arnhem roads, beneath the forest floors of places like Oosterbeek, lay steel and rubber and ammunition. Panthers and tigers, those great cats of German armour, sat hidden in copses and clearings, camouflaged with branches and canvas. Half-tracks full of soldiers waited in villages, whose names would soon appear in radio broadcasts and newspaper dispatches across the world. A division, an entire division of Waffen-SS Panzer troops, was resting in this landscape, scattered and dispersed, recovering from months of grinding combat, rebuilding itself in the relative quiet of occupied Holland in September of 1944. The men in those vehicles and those woods did not know that the sky above them would soon darken with parachutes. The commanders in their command posts did not suspect that within days this corner of the Netherlands would become the focal point of the greatest airborne invasion ever attempted. And across the Channel, in England, the planners who orchestrated Operation Market Garden, that vast and ambitious attempt to open a corridor into the German heartland, had no idea that the Germans they sought to bypass and encircle had, through a quirk of timing and logistics, positioned themselves almost directly in the path of the largest airborne assault in military history. The 9th SS Panzer Division Hohenstaufen was not supposed to be there, or rather, it was there for reasons that seemed entirely logical and bureaucratic at the time. Routine military decisions made in the vast machinery of the Nazi war effort. And yet, by a convergence of circumstance that historians still puzzle over, this particular unit, with its specific equipment and its specific men and its specific location, would collide with those thousands of paratroopers descending from the sky, and in that collision would alter the course of one of the war's most dramatic episodes. But to understand how a rebuilding Waffen-SS division came to be in that place at that moment, and to understand the men who filled its ranks, and the armour they commanded, and the battles they had already survived to reach that quiet Dutch countryside, we must begin much earlier. We must trace the origins of these men and this unit back through years of warfare and ideology, through the forests of Ukraine and the rubble of Normandy, through the desperate calculations of German military leadership in a war that was slowly, inexorably turning against them. If you are interested in following that story, if you want to walk through the history of the 9th SS Hohenstaufen Division with all its technical detail and human complexity, in a narrative that holds nothing back about the nature of this unit and the forces it served, while honoring the historical record and the memory of all those touched by these events, I invite you to subscribe to this channel for the complete account of Arnhem's hidden panzers. Now, let us return to that misty dawn and understand what came before it. The Waffen-SS was not born in the opening days of World War II. It grew, slowly and then with accelerating speed, from the ranks of the Nazi Party's paramilitary arm, the SS itself. In the 1930s, there existed something called the SS Verfügungstruppe, the SS Disposal Troops, a small, elite force that served alongside the regular German army, the Wehrmacht. These men saw themselves as ideologically pure, as the military manifestation of the Nazi Party's vision, distinct from the older traditions of Prussian soldiering that still animated the conventional officer corps. When war came in 1939, this force expanded, and it expanded not because of careful planning or long-standing doctrine, but because the Nazi regime discovered that it could raise military units outside the normal army structure, units answerable to Heinrich Himmler and the SS command, not to the Wehrmacht's high command. What began as a few thousand ideologically committed volunteers became, by 1943 and 1944, a vast organization. Some men joined willingly. Some were conscripted into SS units, particularly those from occupied territories or ethnic Germans from lands on the periphery of the Reich. And as the war deepened and casualties mounted, the SS, like the Wehrmacht, became increasingly dependent on ever younger recruits, men with less training, less experience, less connection perhaps to the ideological fervor that had marked the earliest volunteers. The Waffen-SS built itself on a mythology of elite soldiering. Its propaganda emphasized toughness, loyalty, the bond between comrades forged in combat. And there is no question that many of its units, particularly the Panzer divisions, fought with considerable skill and determination. But this elite status came at a cost, and that cost was moral. The Waffen-SS units, particularly the Panzer divisions with their motorized mobility and their firepower, were often deployed not merely as combat forces, but as instruments of terror and enforcement. They were used to suppress partisan activity in occupied territories. They were integral to operations that targeted civilians. The history of the Waffen-SS, in short, cannot be separated from the broader crimes of the Nazi regime. The 9th SS Panzer Division Hohenstaufen emerged in the spring of 1943 in the occupied territories of France, formed from cadres of experienced soldiers and a flood of new recruits. Its name looked backward, to the medieval German dynasty of the Hohenstaufens, a choice that reflected the SS's fascination with German history and its attempt to ground Nazi ideology in supposed historical greatness. The division adopted insignia and symbols drawn from that feudal past, and from the beginning, it was conceived as a mobile strike force, a panzer division equipped with the heaviest tanks the German army could produce, its armored vehicles meant to move quickly across the landscape, to concentrate firepower, to achieve breakthrough and exploitation. In those early months of its existence, in the training camps and assembly areas of France, the 9th Hohenstaufen received an influx of young men. Some were transfers from other SS units, hard-bitten veterans of the Eastern Front. Others were recent conscripts, 18 and 19 years old, pulled into the Waffen-SS through the conscription processes that had become necessary as the war demanded more and more manpower. These young men arrived with varying degrees of training, varying degrees of commitment to Nazi ideology. They were equipped with uniforms and weapons. They were subjected to the rhythms of military discipline. They were integrated into a structure that emphasized obedience, unit cohesion, and the subordination of individual will to the collective purpose. What thoughts occupied these men as they trained? What did they understand about where they were being sent and what they might be asked to do? The historical record offers fragments. Memoirs and testimonies suggest a range of experience. Some men animated by genuine ideological conviction, others simply doing their duty as soldiers, others troubled by what they sensed they might become part of. But in the spring of 1943, with the unit still forming, with the war still in flux, the future was not yet written. What if one of the largest airborne operations in military history, a bold gamble to end the war in Europe by Christmas, had been undone by a division that by all strategic logic should never have been there at all. This is the strange, almost accidental convergence that shaped the fate of Operation Market Garden in September 1944. A panzer division that had been shattered on the Eastern Front, hastily rebuilt in the French countryside, and positioned near a small Dutch city, with no one quite expecting them to be there, would become the immovable obstacle that Allied planners had failed to account for. It is a story that hinges not on grand strategy alone, but on the quiet presence of exhausted soldiers, on the grinding persistence of units that should have been broken, and on how history sometimes turns on what was overlooked rather than what was planned. The division in question was the 9th SS Panzer Division Hohenstaufen, a unit that had already seen the worst that modern warfare could offer. Formed only the year before, it had been thrust into the meat grinder of the Eastern Front, where the raw mathematics of tank warfare and infantry attrition operated in a register that Western Europe, for all its horrors, had never quite experienced. They had fought through encirclements and desperate relief operations. They had withdrawn westward through the spring and summer of 1944, their ranks thinned, their equipment salvaged and patched together from the wreckage of other units. By September, they were refitting, reorganizing, drawing breath before whatever came next. No one in the planning rooms of the Allied forces seemed to know, or perhaps to believe, that they were there at all. And yet they were, hidden in forests near Arnhem, spread across a landscape of Dutch polder and German-occupied villages. The Hohenstaufen Division represented a pocket of organized German armor that intelligence reports had, for various reasons, failed to accurately locate or assess. When the British and American airborne forces descended from the sky, thousands of paratroopers and glider troops arriving on that clear September morning, they encountered not the light resistance they expected, but a disciplined, battle-hardened panzer division that could only have appeared more inconvenient had it been sent there by malevolent fate itself. The collision between these two forces, between the audacity of Market Garden and the grim resilience of Hohenstaufen, would become one of the war's great turning points, not because of any brilliant tactical decision, but because of the presence of men and machines in the wrong place at the right moment. This is the story of how that division came to be there. It is a journey through the institution of the Waffen-SS itself, through the mechanisms by which divisions were raised and trained and sent to war. It is a study of the Hohenstaufen's formation, its identity as a unit, the young men, some volunteers, some conscripts, who filled its ranks and fought under its standards. It is an exploration of the raw logistics of panzer divisions, the tanks, the half-tracks, the anti-tank guns, the supply lines that made them function. And it is, fundamentally, an account of how this particular unit moved through the war, from its inception in France to its baptism of fire in Ukraine, through the grinding attrition of 1944, and into that pivotal moment at Arnhem when everything changed. The history of a military unit, especially one as controversial as an SS Panzer Division, is never simple. It touches on the nature of the regime it served, the choices made by individuals who were part of something larger than themselves, and the strange, often accidental ways in which history unfolds. It requires us to hold multiple truths in mind at once: the reality of an institution that was bound to a totalitarian ideology, and the human reality of soldiers who were caught up in it. It means examining not just the grand sweep of events, but the quiet details, the kind of regimental culture that developed, the technical specifications of the equipment, the texture of life in a unit being rebuilt after catastrophic losses. If you find yourself drawn to the intricate detail of how military divisions function, to the way grand strategic plans meet the friction of reality, to the almost accidental turning points that shape the course of history, then this particular journey through the story of the 9th SS Hohenstaufen, from its birth to its role at Arnhem and beyond, is one you might travel along with us, and we would invite you to subscribe now so that you might follow this entire arc of a division's rise and diminishment across nearly 2 years of war. What follows is the slow unfolding of that history, beginning at the very roots of the Waffen-SS itself, that institution that was built on ideology and industrial killing. The institutions of Nazi Germany are not pleasant subjects to contemplate, but they are necessary ones to understand, because they shaped how men were organized, trained, and sent to their fates. And the Waffen-SS, despite its mystique, and despite the mythology that would grow up around it, was ultimately an instrument of a state and a regime whose moral character was among the darkest in human history. Yet the story of Hohenstaufen is not a story of ideology alone. It is a story of soldiers, of logistics, of the strange contingency of war, and of how history refuses to follow the neat paths that planners imagine for it. To understand how a unit like the 9th SS Hohenstaufen came to exist at all, we must step back from the autumn mists of Arnhem and consider something quieter, more institutional, and far less visible than any single battle. The Waffen-SS itself, the armed wing of the Nazi Party's paramilitary organization, began not as the coherent military force it would become, but as something more fragmented, a collection of ideological enforcers, party loyalty made uniform, existing in awkward tension with the traditional German army, the Wehrmacht, which viewed it with a mixture of necessity and disdain. In the early years of the regime, the SS had been primarily an internal security apparatus. But as Germany's territorial ambitions grew, and as war itself became inevitable rather than theoretical, the Nazi leadership faced a pragmatic problem. Ideology could not alone fill the ranks needed for modern industrial warfare. The Waffen-SS, then, represented an evolution. It was a deliberate attempt to fuse Nazi party politics with conventional military structure, to create soldiers who were not merely trained, but ideologically committed, in a way the regular army often was not. This was the theory, at any rate, though the reality would prove far more complicated. When war came in September 1939, the Waffen-SS was still small, numbering perhaps 30,000 men across several divisions. These early units were relatively elite, recruited from among Nazi Party faithful, and they fought with considerable distinction in Poland and in the campaign against France. Their success, however, created a hunger for expansion. More divisions meant more political power within the Nazi state, more prestige, more resources. And as the regular army, the Wehrmacht, suffered mounting casualties on the Eastern Front after 1941, there was a strange kind of competition for manpower between the two institutions, one that the SS, with all its political connections and ideological fervor, proved remarkably adept at winning. The ideology that drove this expansion is worth examining carefully, though it requires a gentle approach. The Waffen-SS was structured around concepts of racial hierarchy, of a warrior elite bound by bonds of loyalty that transcended conventional military discipline. Membership was theoretically restricted to those who could prove pure Aryan ancestry, though this requirement would be steadily relaxed as the war progressed and casualties mounted. There was a quasi-religious quality to much of the rhetoric surrounding the organization, references to ancient Germanic warriors and modern destiny. Training camps were designed not merely to produce soldiers, but to forge a particular kind of worldview, one that placed the SS member at the apex of a racial and martial order. Yet here is a paradox worth resting on for a moment. As the war ground on and as losses accumulated, the Waffen-SS, like the Wehrmacht itself, became increasingly composed of conscripts rather than true believers. By the time the 9th SS Hohenstaufen was being formed in 1943, the pool of ideologically committed volunteers had largely been exhausted. The division would contain many young men who had been drafted, often as replacements for those killed in earlier battles. Men who found themselves wearing the SS uniform not necessarily because they had chosen to, but because the machinery of German conscription had dictated it. The gap between ideology and reality, between what the SS aspired to be and what it actually was, grew wider as the years passed. The expansion of the Waffen-SS in the early 1940s followed a particular logic. Each successful operation seemed to justify the creation of new formations. Each new formation, once created, acquired its own political constituency and its own hunger for recognition and resources. By 1942, there were perhaps 10 SS divisions in various stages of formation or deployment. By 1943, the number had reached the teens. By 1944, when Hohenstaufen was being readied for combat, there were dozens. This growth was sustained partly through ideology, certainly, but also through the brute fact of conscription, through the demands of warfare, and through the administrative machinery of the state, which, once set in motion, continued grinding forward almost of its own momentum. What is important to understand, as we consider the 9th SS Hohenstaufen, is that it was a product of this broader institution, but not an inevitable or unique product. There was nothing inherently special about Hohenstaufen at its inception. It was one formation among many, created according to a template that had been established and refined through the earlier divisions. Its ideological framing was that of the Waffen-SS as a whole, the aspirational mythology, the claims of elite status, the invocation of a racial order that was fundamental to Nazi ideology. And yet, like many German military units, it would develop its own culture, its own officers and traditions, its own accumulated experience. It would become, in time, something more specific than merely another SS division. But that specificity emerged through experience and action, not through any predetermined destiny. The question of how and why ordinary young men, for they were mostly young, came to find themselves in SS uniforms is one that historians have wrestled with for decades. Some were volunteers, drawn by propaganda or by family connections or by opportunities for advancement. Some were conscripted through the normal draft machinery, and when they found themselves assigned to the SS, they simply accepted it. Some may have harbored genuine ideological commitment. Others may have been consciously indifferent to the ideology, focused instead on survival, on doing their job, on making it through the war. The truth likely contains all of these elements in varying proportions, distributed across thousands of individuals who left few written records of their private thoughts. As we prepare to move forward into the specific formation of the 9th SS Hohenstaufen in France, it is worth carrying this understanding with us. The division was a creature of wartime expansion and institutional momentum, shaped by ideology and propaganda, but also populated by human beings of varied backgrounds and varied commitments. It would soon be sent eastward, into the grinding reality of the Eastern Front, where ideological certainties would meet the chaotic and terrible demands of industrial warfare. And in that crucible, the division would be forged not by propaganda films or training camp speeches, but by the simple, profound experience of combat and survival. In the spring of 1943, as the European war deepened and German military planners looked at the sprawling landscape of their commitments, a decision was made in the bureaucratic quarters of the Nazi state to build something new, a fresh Panzer Division, one that would carry both the prestige and the particular ideology of the SS. The location chosen was France, far from the grinding exhaustion of the Eastern Front, in regions where training grounds could be established away from the immediate shadow of combat. And there, among the rolling countryside and the military installations already dotted across occupied France, the 9th SS Panzer Division began to cohere from scattered men and material into something that would, by late 1943, become a coherent fighting force. The name given to this division was Hohenstaufen, drawn from one of the great medieval royal dynasties of Central Europe, the Staufen family, whose emperors and kings had ruled the Holy Roman Empire in the 12th and 13th centuries. There was, in this choice of nomenclature, something that reveals the particular character of how the SS saw itself and the divisions it was building. Rather than naming units after geographic regions or numbers alone, as the Wehrmacht often did, the SS chose names rich with historical resonance, with a sense of lineage and cultural continuity. Hohenstaufen evoked a notion of imperial grandeur, of German dominion reaching backward through time. It was a naming convention meant to invest these formations with a sense of historical destiny, a feeling that they belonged to something larger than mere military organization. The name itself, when spoken or written on documents, was meant to carry weight, to suggest that these men were inheritors of something ancient and powerful. The culture of the new SS Panzer Divisions, and Hohenstaufen in particular, was distinctive in ways both obvious and subtle. Unlike the traditional Wehrmacht Panzer Divisions, which were built on a foundation of professional military hierarchy and technical competence, the SS divisions incorporated within their structure a far more explicit ideological dimension. Officers and men were selected not solely on the basis of military aptitude, though that remained important. There was an ideological screening, an expectation that membership in an SS formation carried with it a particular worldview, a commitment to the broader ideological project of the regime. This did not mean that every soldier was an ideological zealot. Far from it. Many were conscripted, and many were simply young men drawn into the machinery of war. Yet the institutional culture nonetheless carried this dimension, like an undertone that colored everything from recruit training to command philosophy. The formation process itself was methodical and, by the standards of 1943, relatively unhurried. Men were gathered from various sources. Some were SS volunteers, others were transferred from Wehrmacht units, still others were conscripted into the SS system itself. The division began with a core of experienced cadre, officers and NCOs who had served in earlier SS formations or in the Wehrmacht, bringing with them a reservoir of tactical and organizational knowledge. Around this skeleton, younger men were added, many of them barely out of adolescence, full of physical vigor but lacking any combat experience. Training regimens were rigorous. Tank crews practiced their coordination until the movements became almost intuitive. Infantry practiced rapid deployment and assault tactics. Artillery crews became familiar with their guns and the mathematics of ranging and fire control. All of this took time, and the months of 1943 were largely devoted to this patient work of turning disparate men into a functioning military organization. The equipment that Hohenstaufen received reflected the state of German tank production in 1943. Primarily, the division was equipped with Panzer V Panthers and Panzer IV tanks. The Panthers were relatively new at this point, still gaining refinement, but they represented a significant step forward in German tank design, faster, better armed, and better protected than their predecessors. The Panzer IVs, by contrast, were older but proven, reliable workhorses that would form the backbone of German armoured strength for the remainder of the war. Beyond the tanks themselves, the division included infantry transported in half-tracks and on foot, along with extensive supporting elements: anti-tank guns, self-propelled guns, assault guns, reconnaissance elements on motorcycles, and all the intricate web of supply and logistics that kept a military formation moving and fighting. What emerges, if one reflects on this period of the division's existence, is a picture of deliberate construction, an institution being built with care and resources, at a moment when resources were becoming increasingly scarce. The SS, as an organization, had achieved a degree of institutional power and autonomy within the Nazi state, and it was using that power to build military formations that were, in many respects, elite. The men who served in Hohenstaufen in 1943 could not have known, of course, what lay ahead. Some would survive the war and live long lives. Others would die in places they had never heard of, in circumstances unimaginable to them in those early training days. The division itself would, within a year, be tested in ways that would either forge it into something formidable or break it apart entirely. But in 1943, in the French countryside where tanks rumbled across training grounds and officers barked commands and young soldiers learned the discipline and coordination that armored warfare demanded, the 9th SS Panzer Division Hohenstaufen existed as potential, a force not yet unleashed, not yet truly tested, waiting for history to call it forward into the furnace. By the early months of 1943, as the foundational structure of the Hohenstaufen Division took shape in the French countryside, the real work of building a fighting force began not in meetings or administrative offices, but in the recruitment and training of young men who would form its living skeleton. The division needed bodies, minds, discipline, and above all, numbers, thousands upon thousands of them, to fill the ranks of tank crews and panzer grenadiers, and support personnel who would make the machinery of war actually function in the months and years ahead. The sources of these recruits were varied and sometimes contradictory. Some came through the formal conscription system that the Nazi regime had established, young men of military age who had no real choice in the matter, drafted into service as a routine administrative process. Others were volunteers, men who had stepped forward either from genuine ideological conviction or from a more pragmatic calculation that volunteering might offer them some agency in which unit to join, or perhaps better equipment, or the remote hope of better conditions. The distinction between volunteer and conscript was often blurred in practice, though it mattered greatly in the testimonies and records that would survive the war. What is worth noting, speaking plainly, is that the Waffen-SS as a whole drew from both categories, and the Hohenstaufen would be no exception. The majority, perhaps, were not fanatical ideologues, but rather young Germans swept up in the machinery of total war, conscripted at ages as young as 17 or 18, sometimes younger, and directed into this particular division by the administrative logic of wartime military organization. The training grounds themselves were scattered across occupied France and in areas of the Reich proper, camps with names that meant little to outsiders, but everything to those who endured them. Young recruits arrived at places like the training areas around Meilly-le-Camp, or smaller facilities in the shadow of the Alps, where instructors, mostly veterans pulled from the front, would attempt in a compressed span of weeks or months to transform civilians into soldiers. The method was rigorous and unsparing. Physical conditioning was relentless. Marching in full kit under the summer heat or autumn chill, swimming exercises in cold water, obstacle courses designed to test not only strength, but also obedience and the capacity to function under stress and exhaustion. If you think of military training, perhaps you imagine the standardized rhythm of modern procedures, but these camps operated under the pressures and improvisation of a war already 2 years old and growing more desperate. Instructors were often men who had seen combat, men who had lost comrades, men who believed, rightly or wrongly, that the harshness of training might save lives in actual battle. Whether it did or not remains an open historical question, but the intent was there. Tank crew training was particularly specialized and particularly demanding. Operating a panzer, whether as a driver hunched over the controls in near total darkness, or as a gunner tracking moving targets through a periscope sight, or as a loader moving heavy ammunition in a space barely large enough for the human body, these required not only physical capability, but also a kind of mechanical intuition and calm that could only be developed through repeated practice. The training regimen for panzer crews lasted considerably longer than that for regular infantry. Weeks would be spent on gunnery ranges, firing practice rounds at stationary and moving targets, learning to judge distance and lead, learning to suppress the natural human fear response when shells began coming back from enemy positions. Drivers practiced terrain navigation, became familiar with the weight distribution and the quirks of their particular vehicles, learned the engine in an almost tactile way. Loader and commander training involved endless drill: load, fire, reload, move, communicate, the rhythm becoming nearly automatic, so that in the chaos of actual combat, the hands and reflexes could continue functioning even if conscious thought fragmented under stress. The young men themselves left traces in letters, in post-war interviews, in occasional diary fragments that have survived. What emerges is a picture of teenagers and young men in their early 20s experiencing a peculiar form of adolescence within a military structure. Some wrote home about the harshness of training with complaint and homesickness. Others expressed a sense of camaraderie, the bonding that occurs between people enduring hardship together, particularly when many of them came from similar backgrounds: German towns and villages, working-class families, rural areas where military service was an accepted part of the national expectation. A few revealed in their words a genuine excitement about military life, about learning technical skills, about the status and identity that came with membership in the Waffen-SS, which carried a particular cachet even within the broader German military structure. And some, it must be said, showed no particular emotional reaction either way. In the records that survive, they simply did what was asked of them, maintained discipline, completed their training, and moved toward whatever fate awaited them. The broader organizational structure that received these recruits was itself relatively new, still being refined and developed even as training proceeded. A Panzer Division of the Waffen-SS operated differently in many respects from a Wehrmacht Panzer Division, though the differences were sometimes more matters of ideology and structure than of practical tactical effect. The SS divisions, by design, were intended to maintain higher levels of ideological cohesion and political reliability, which meant that officers and senior non-commissioned officers often spent considerable time on political education and indoctrination alongside military instruction. Does this mean that every young recruit spent his days absorbed in Nazi ideology, brainwashed into fanaticism? The historical record suggests something more complex and less uniform. Some divisions, some units, maintained this focus intensely. Others, particularly as the war progressed and casualties mounted, became increasingly focused simply on tactical effectiveness and survival. The distinction mattered then, and it matters now in understanding what these men actually experienced and believed. The Panzer Grenadiers, the mechanized infantry who would fight alongside and in support of the tanks, came through their own training pipeline, similarly demanding in different ways. They needed to be comfortable with both vehicle operations and dismounted infantry tactics, needed to understand how to coordinate with tank support, needed to survive in the spaces between vehicles where small arms fire and shell fragments were the primary threats. Some Panzer Grenadiers would ride into battle in half-tracks, armoured personnel carriers that offered some protection but no turret weaponry, making them vulnerable once they dismounted. Others trained for purely mounted operations or for close support roles. The sheer variety of specialized roles within a division meant that training was never entirely standardized, though common elements, marching, weapons handling, obedience to command structure, threaded through all of it. As 1943 deepened into its later months and the division's training phase continued, there were also losses even before any actual combat. Training accidents claimed lives. Illness took men away from their units, particularly as different regions of France and the Reich carried different disease environments. The occasional training exercise conducted with live ammunition resulted in casualties. These were the hidden costs of military preparation, the deaths that happened far from the attention of historians because they served no tactical purpose, secured no ground, achieved no military objective. A young man from Hamburg killed when a live grenade detonated unexpectedly during a training exercise, or a driver from Bavaria crushed when a panzer slipped on muddy terrain during a gunnery drill. These deaths were administrative losses, written into casualty lists, but rarely given the narrative weight that combat deaths received. What emerges from this period of preparation, then, is neither an army of demon ideologues nor a force of innocent conscripts, simply swept along by events. It was something more human and more complicated. Thousands of young men, drawn from varying backgrounds and with varying motivations, being shaped through rigorous training into military formations designed to function as a coherent, disciplined force. Some of them would later distinguish themselves for courage or skill. Others would become cautious or fearful once exposed to actual combat. Many would simply do their jobs adequately enough to survive, if survival were possible. All of them, though, were being prepared for a role in one of history's largest and most consequential conflicts, and the camps and training grounds of France in 1943 were the crucible in which that preparation took place. Far from the eye of strategic planners and newspaper reporters, quiet except for the sounds of marching feet and engine tests, and the distant crack of rifle fire on practice ranges. Within those training grounds of occupied France, the young men of Hohenstaufen were learning not only discipline and obedience, but the intricate choreography of armor itself. A Panzer Division was not simply a collection of tanks, it was a layered, interconnected organism, each part dependent on the others, and to understand how Hohenstaufen would later move and fight, we must first understand how it was built, piece by careful piece. At the very heart of the division sat its tanks. The Panzer IV was the workhorse, a medium tank that had become familiar to German crews across Russia and North Africa. By 1943, when Hohenstaufen was forming, the Panzer IV represented a kind of reliable balance, sturdy armor plating, reasonable speed, a dependable gun that could engage most Allied vehicles at distances that mattered. A single Panzer IV carried a crew of 5, a commander who orchestrated the whole machine, a gunner with his eye pressed to the sight, a loader feeding shells into the breech, a driver navigating terrain and obstacles, and a radio operator who kept the tank in touch with its platoon. These 5 men became a unit unto themselves, bound together in the dark interior, their trust in one another absolute. But there were also the heavier tanks, the Panthers and the Tigers, vehicles that inspired both fear and respect across European battlefields. The Panther, with its sloped armor and powerful gun, began appearing in German formations with increasing frequency as the war deepened. The Tiger was rarer, more mythologized, a tank that seemed to embody German engineering prowess, though in reality it was slow, mechanically temperamental, and consumed fuel at prodigious rates. Each of these tanks required specialists to maintain them, men who understood the grinding of gears and the heating of engines under stress. And consider, if you will, how many spare parts, how much ammunition, how much fuel had to move through supply lines just to keep a single Panther operational. The logistics were staggering, almost crushingly complex. Beyond the tanks, the division's true strength lay in its Panzer Grenadier battalions, the mechanized infantry. These men rode into battle in half-tracks, open-topped vehicles that combined the mobility of a tracked chassis with the carrying capacity to transport a full squad of soldiers. The SDKFZ-251 half-track became iconic to German mechanized warfare, a platform that could cross rough terrain, ford shallow rivers, and deposit soldiers directly into combat, while still offering some protection from small arms fire. Each half-track carried 7 to 10 men, depending on configuration, and was usually armed with an MG-42 machine gun mounted in a swivel ring. Imagine riding in the back of such a vehicle, metal bench seats, the roar of the engine, the smell of oil and diesel, the knowledge that when you reached your destination, you would have to jump down and fight. The soldiers of Hohenstaufen trained on these machines until movement became second nature, until the coordinated dismount and assault were as automatic as breathing. Artillery provided the sinew of the division's firepower. The 105mm howitzer was the standard field gun, capable of lobbing shells across distances that made it invisible to the target, yet devastatingly effective in suppressing enemy positions. These guns were towed by half-tracks or trucks, and their effectiveness depended entirely on good intelligence, accurate maps, and forward observers who could call in corrections. A well-coordinated artillery barrage was almost hypnotic in its power, shells whistling through the sky, exploding in overlapping patterns, the earth erupting in fountains of soil and rock. Yet behind each volley stood enormous complexity, ammunition supply lines, gun crews working in tight synchronization, officers calculating trajectories and fuses. The division also maintained its own anti-tank company, equipped with the 75mm PaK-40 gun, a towed weapon that could penetrate the armor of most Allied tanks at reasonable ranges. These anti-tank gunners occupied a peculiar and terrifying niche in the military hierarchy. They had to remain stationary, making them vulnerable, and yet they were the final defense against overwhelming mechanized assault. In Hohenstaufen, as in other German divisions, these crews were selected carefully, trained extensively in camouflage and rapid deployment. Supporting all of this, the tanks, the half-tracks, the guns, was an administrative and logistical structure that few soldiers ever saw. Supply officers, mechanics, signal personnel, medical orderlies, drivers of fuel trucks and ammunition lorries. A panzer division required thousands of personnel, only a fraction of whom would ever fire a weapon in anger. The division's headquarters occupied a small town or a compound of farms, with radios crackling constantly, maps being updated by hand, officers making decisions based on incomplete information under impossible pressure. The noise of these operations, the endless movement of vehicles, the smell of engine fumes, these created an atmosphere of controlled chaos that was, in its own way, as dangerous as the front lines. Consider, too, the communication systems that held the division together. Radio operators with headsets, their voices crackling through static, maintaining the net that connected company commanders to platoon leaders to individual tank crews. This network of voices was the nervous system of Hohenstaufen, allowing rapid orders to cascade down the chain of command, allowing information about enemy positions to flow upward. Without these voices, without the clear protocols of radio discipline that German officers insisted upon, the division would have been a collection of isolated vehicles and squads, operating blindly. By early 1943, Hohenstaufen had been equipped and trained into a formidable instrument of war. Its organization reflected the latest German thinking about mechanized warfare, combined arms doctrine that integrated armor, infantry, and artillery in mutually supporting formations. A panzer regiment might consist of 2 battalions, each with several companies of tanks, while the division also fielded panzer grenadier regiments with their complement of half-tracks. The interplay between these elements, when executed with precision, created a kind of military synergy that could overwhelm opponents relying on less integrated tactics. Yet there was something almost melancholic about contemplating this machine as it existed in 1943. All of this equipment, all of this careful training, All of these young men learning to coordinate like parts of an engine. All of it was being prepared for use on the Eastern Front, where German technology and organization would meet something that neither could ultimately overcome: the vast resources and inexhaustible manpower of the Soviet Union. The division's equipment was modern and capable, but it was also finite. Every tank destroyed in Russia was one less tank available for future campaigns. Every experienced crew member killed or wounded was a loss that training could not quickly replace. And yet, in those French training areas, as the spring of 1943 gave way to summer, the men of Hohenstaufen had no way of knowing where their division would go, what it would face, or what price it would ultimately pay for the role it had been given in the Nazi war machine. They knew only their immediate tasks: learn to operate their equipment, master the complex movements of a coordinated unit, become as efficient as possible in the craft of modern warfare. Their equipment was good, their officers were experienced, and they were ready, in the way that soldiers are always ready, without fully comprehending what readiness truly costs. By the spring of 1944, as the division completed its formation and training in France, orders arrived to move eastward. The 9th SS Panzer Division Hohenstaufen, still relatively fresh and at nearly full strength, was being redirected toward the Soviet theater, not to stand in defense of German soil, but to take part in what Berlin hoped might be a decisive counteroffensive in Ukraine. It was April when the first echelons of the division began their long journey by rail toward the east, passing through the great continental expanse, where the war had become something altogether different from what the younger soldiers had known in their training grounds. The Eastern Front in 1944 was no longer the fluid, rapid warfare theater of earlier campaigns. The Soviets had learned, adapted, and grown enormously in strength. The landscape that greeted the Hohenstaufen as it deployed into Ukraine was one of vast distances, unreliable supply lines, and an enemy that seemed, despite German losses and sacrifices, only to grow larger. The terrain itself presented a challenge unlike anything the division had faced. The spring mud, that terrible Rasputitsa that swallowed vehicles and slowed movement to a crawl, was just beginning to dry when Hohenstaufen's columns rolled into their operational areas near the Dniester River and further south toward the Sea of Azov. The country was brown and grey, punctuated by destroyed villages, scorched earth that the retreating Soviets had left behind in earlier phases, and now, as Hohenstaufen arrived, it was Soviet territory that Germany was desperately trying to reclaim or at least hold. The supply lines stretched impossibly long. To feed and fuel a panzer division across these distances required an almost superhuman logistical effort. The division's vehicles, the Panther tanks with their formidable 85mm guns, the heavier Tigers where they were available, the Panzer Grenadiers in their half-tracked personnel carriers, the anti-tank guns, the field kitchens, the ammunition trucks, the fuel tankers, all of this machinery required constant replenishment. But the rails were stretched thin, and the roads, such as they were, became quagmires during the brief rainy seasons. The logistics officers of the division spent sleepless nights calculating how many tons of fuel could reach the front, how many days' worth of ammunition they might have, whether the division would be properly supplied for an operation, or whether it would have to make do with less. It was a calculus that grew more desperate with each passing month. The division's first significant engagement came near Tarnopol, a city in Galicia that the Soviets had recaptured, and where German forces, including elements of the Wehrmacht and SS, found themselves in an increasingly desperate struggle. But before examining that battle in detail, consider what the deployment itself meant for the men of Hohenstaufen. Many of them had never experienced prolonged combat. They had trained, they had paraded, they had prepared for war with the intensity that German military culture demanded. But the actuality of the Eastern Front was something their training could only partially prepare them for. The sheer scale of Soviet forces, the apparent endless reserves of manpower, the relentless artillery barrages that could come without warning. These things were different from the tactical problems posed by exercises or the controlled environment of training grounds. The terrain of Ukraine in spring and early summer presented its own severe trials. The distances were vast in a way that perhaps no soldier from the west of the Reich could fully comprehend before arriving there. A journey that might take a few hours in France could consume an entire day in Ukraine. The heat, when it came, was intense and unrelenting. The dust thrown up by thousands of vehicles on unprepared roads coated everything: the engines, the uniforms, the faces of exhausted men. Where there was no dust, there was mud, and where there was neither, there was simply endless steppe-like grassland, rolling and monotonous, offering no shelter, nowhere to hide, nowhere to rest that felt truly safe. The divisions that were sent to the Eastern Front in 1944, even fresh divisions like Hohenstaufen, arrived into a war that had already ground itself nearly to exhaustion on both sides. The Soviet army, despite its terrible losses in earlier years, had rebuilt itself into something formidable. The German army, by contrast, was stretched to its limits, trying to hold territory from the Arctic to the Black Sea, with resources that no longer seemed adequate to the task. When Hohenstaufen entered this vast theatre, it did so knowing that it would be thrown into an already massive meat grinder of a conflict. The officers knew it. The senior NCOs knew it. The young conscripts, some of them barely out of their teens, could begin to sense it from the moment they saw the devastation of the landscape, the ruins of towns and villages, the signs of immense, ongoing destruction that no training film could have truly conveyed. The division's movement toward its first assignments took it through territory that had changed hands multiple times. The landscape bore the scars of earlier campaigns: burnt-out tanks, both German and Soviet, sometimes still visible at the roadside, weathered by sun and rain, graves marked with rough crosses, the skeletal remains of forests where artillery had done its work. It was a landscape that spoke of scale, of brutality, of the sheer mechanical violence that modern warfare could inflict. The roads themselves, often little more than tracks beaten into the earth, bore witness to the passage of armies: Soviet armies retreating, German armies advancing, then later German armies withdrawing. The logistical infrastructure that might have existed before the war had been destroyed or disrupted. New supply depots had to be established, new fuel dumps, new ammunition storage areas. The division had to adapt to an operational environment that was altogether harsher and more demanding than anything the comfortable training grounds of France had suggested. By May of 1944, as Hohenstaufen took up its positions in the Ukrainian theatre, the division's new soldiers, many of whom had barely weeks or months of operational experience, began to understand that this was not a war of quick victories and glorious maneuvers. This was a war of attrition, a war where supplies mattered as much as bravery, where the enemy seemed not to retreat into disorder, but rather to absorb punishment and then reform. The grinding, relentless reality of the Eastern Front was beginning to settle into the consciousness of the unit. They had arrived ready for combat, trained and organized, equipped with some of the finest tanks and weapons available to any army in the world. But they had arrived into a war that would test not just their equipment and their training, but their endurance, their will, and their ability to survive in an environment that seemed designed by history itself to break them down. The division's first trial by fire would arrive in the spring of 1944, not under the grey skies of Normandy, but in the mud and snow of a place that few in the West had ever heard of. Tarnopol, a city in Ukrainian territory, sat on a line that was collapsing. The Soviet advance had rolled westward with relentless momentum, and entire German formations found themselves not in orderly retreat, but in desperate encirclement. The Hohenstaufen, only months into its operational life, was rushed eastward by rail to attempt what had begun to seem impossible, a relief operation in the chaos of the crumbling Eastern Front. Picture, if you can, the confusion of those late March days. The Soviet winter offensive had broken the German lines across a broad front. Tarnopol itself held a German garrison, perhaps 4,000 men, cut off from the rest of the Wehrmacht by advancing Soviet armor and mechanized columns. The decision came down from higher command. The Hohenstaufen, still lean and under strength but equipped with relatively new panzers, would attempt to drive east through contested terrain and force an opening. It was a mission that would teach the young division the difference between training ground exercises and the grinding reality of warfare, where the enemy did not yield to clever maneuvers, but instead multiplied and pressed from every direction. The journey to the operational area was itself an ordeal that has been largely forgotten in the historical record. The division moved by road and rail through territory where partisan activity remained constant, where supply lines stretched thin and vulnerable, where the landscape itself, thawing from winter into a muddy spring, became as much an enemy as the Soviet forces. Soldiers who had trained in comfortable French garrison towns now experienced the bitter poverty of Eastern European infrastructure, the sense of operating in a foreign land where the population was either hostile or terrified or both. When the Hohenstaufen's forward elements reached the vicinity of Tarnopol in early April, they encountered a Soviet force that vastly outnumbered them. The encirclement was not tidy. It was a ragged, expanding zone of combat, where Soviet units pressed in from multiple directions, probing for weaknesses. The German garrison inside Tarnopol, rather than waiting passively to be liberated, had already begun preparing defensive positions and rationing supplies. They understood, with a soldier's clarity, that relief might not arrive, and if it did, it would cost blood. The fighting that developed over the following weeks has the quality in historical accounts of what one might call grinding stalemate, punctuated by sudden violence. The Hohenstaufen's armor, particularly the Panther tanks that represented the division's striking power, would advance through farmland and small villages, supported by infantry who moved cautiously, aware that Soviet anti-tank rifles and field guns were positioned to ambush any rash movement. Unlike the open-field maneuvers of France, this was a constrained, measured kind of warfare, where every kilometer gained seemed to consume disproportionate resources and casualties. What historians sometimes notice but rarely emphasize is the human dimension of this struggle. The young men of the Hohenstaufen, many of them still teenagers or in their early 20s, were experiencing their first sustained combat. They were not fanatical ideologues. The majority were conscripts and volunteers whose commitment to the Nazi regime ranged from genuine to minimal to reluctant. But in the moment of actual combat, ideology becomes almost beside the point. Survival becomes the currency of decision-making. Staying alive, keeping your unit intact, understanding that the man next to you will determine whether you see evening becomes everything. The relief operation, as it developed, took on an almost desperate character. The Soviet forces surrounding Tarnopol were not merely defending, they were actively attempting to widen the encirclement, to prevent any German relief force from linking up with the garrison. This meant that the Hohenstaufen found itself fighting not simply toward an objective, but against an enemy that was simultaneously attempting to prevent it from reaching that objective. Do you see the geometry of the problem? The Soviets controlled the space between the relief column and the besieged city, and they had both numerical superiority and the advantage of interior lines. They could move between threatened sectors more quickly than the Germans could reinforce any particular breakthrough attempt. By mid-April, after weeks of grinding advances and tactical engagements, The Hohenstaufen had managed to establish contact with the garrison in Tarnopol, though the corridor remained tenuous and under constant artillery bombardment. The breakthrough, if one could call it that, was achieved but not secured. Soviet artillery rained down on the German positions, and the Red Army continued to press against the fragile connection between the relief force and the besieged troops. What followed was perhaps the most human element of this engagement: the evacuation of the wounded and the exhausted. The corridor that had been fought for with such difficulty now became a conduit for the removal of those who could not continue the fight. Trucks and half-tracks moved back and forth under fire, carrying men who had been holding Tarnopol through weeks of siege conditions. Some of those who emerged from the city were combat effective, others were broken by hunger, exhaustion, and psychological strain. The Hohenstaufen soldiers, themselves depleted by the relief operation, now found themselves serving in a supporting role, holding the corridor open while others escaped. The relief of Tarnopol, if it succeeded in extracting the garrison, came at considerable cost to the Hohenstaufen Division. The exact casualty figures from this period remain somewhat uncertain. Wartime records were imperfect, and the chaos of the Eastern Front meant that precise accounting was often impossible. But contemporary accounts suggest that the division lost several hundred men killed and wounded, along with tanks and other vehicles that could not be easily replaced. More significantly, the division had learned what sustained Eastern Front combat actually meant. It meant attrition. It meant that victory and defeat became almost relative terms. You survived, your unit held together, you extracted as many people as possible from an impossible situation. By those measures, Tarnopol could be counted a success, though a hollow one. The experience left marks on the Hohenstaufen that would persist through the remainder of its existence. The officers and men who had fought at Tarnopol carried with them an understanding that the Soviet enemy was not the same as what they had encountered elsewhere, that the scale of forces involved in the Eastern theatre dwarfed anything in the West, and that the losses they would sustain would only accelerate as the war ground on. This knowledge would shape how they fought in subsequent campaigns, would inform their understanding of what was strategically possible, would strip away any remaining idealism about rapid German victory and replace it with a grimmer calculus of survival and holding the line. When, several months later, the division would be withdrawn westward to France for refitting and rest before the Normandy campaign, the veterans of Tarnopol would carry those muddy, snow-tinged memories with them. They would remember the sound of Soviet artillery, the vastness of the eastern landscape, the peculiar exhaustion that came from fighting an enemy that seemed boundless in numbers and determination. In the relative comfort of French garrison towns, such memories would feel almost unreal, yet they would remain, shaping how men understood their place in this war, how they comprehended their division's role in the larger conflict, and what they might expect in whatever trials lay ahead. The retreat from Tarnopol had left the Hohenstaufen severely bloodied. What remained of the division, men who had endured the chaos of encirclement and the grueling counterattack that had finally broken the siege, began the long, cautious withdrawal westward through the summer of 1944. The Eastern Front was collapsing in slow motion around them. Soviet advances were methodical and seemingly endless, pushing German forces back across the very territories they had conquered only months before. For the Hohenstaufen, the journey from Ukraine toward the relative safety of occupied France would take weeks, moving by rail and road through territories that grew progressively more secure as distance from the fighting lines increased. This withdrawal was not a simple matter of loading men onto trains and departing. The division had to abandon much equipment. Damaged tanks that could not be repaired in the field were destroyed to prevent capture. Supply lines were stretched thin. The men who made the journey west were exhausted in a way that sleep alone could not remedy. Not the physical tiredness that resolves with rest, but the deep, bone-level weariness that comes from months of unrelenting combat, from watching friends die, from the constant awareness that survival was never guaranteed. Many of those who rode westward on those rail cars were conscripts, young men from across occupied Europe who had been conscripted into the Waffen-SS, their eyes hollow with experiences no young person should carry. By late summer of 1944, the division was reassembled in France, in the region between Paris and the Norman coast. The choice of location was deliberate. The Hohenstaufen needed to rest, to refit, to absorb new recruits and new equipment. The German High Command understood that divisions pulled from the Eastern Front, even elite panzer units, required time to rebuild their cohesion and materiel strength. Where exactly did the leadership decide these exhausted soldiers would regather? The Beveland Peninsula and the areas around Utrecht and Arnhem seemed like quiet backwater locations, far enough from the main theatres of immediate concern, yet accessible enough that the division could be moved forward quickly if needed. This would prove to be a choice freighted with unforeseen consequence, though no one could have known it at the time. The refitting process was methodical. New Panther tanks began arriving from German factories. Panthers were excellent machines, faster than the Soviet tanks the men had just been fighting, with superior optics and a more reliable gun. But they were not invulnerable, and the men who had fought in older tanks knew the difference that better armor and firepower could make. Half-tracks arrived to replace those that had been lost. Ammunition was stockpiled. Spare parts were organized in depots. The administrative machinery of a Panzer Division, which had been running on fumes in the east, began to function more smoothly. New NCOs and officers, men who had proven themselves in combat or who had been selected from training establishments, took their places within the reformed command structure. The soldiers themselves had a different kind of recovery to undertake. What percentage of the men who withdrew from Tarnopol were the same faces who had formed up in France in early 1943? The number was surprisingly small. Casualties, killed, wounded too severely to return to duty, or captured, had consumed the original cohort. What remained were the survivors, men hardened by experience, and what filled the gaps were new arrivals, younger conscripts, some of whom had received only minimal training. The bond between the veterans and the newcomers was something other than what it might have been in a peacetime army. The veterans knew what was coming. They knew what shellfire sounded like, what it meant to see the man next to you fall, what it felt like when ammunition ran low and the enemy was still advancing. How do you prepare a young soldier for something like that? You could not, really. You could only train them to follow orders and to move according to routine, and hope that instinct and discipline would carry them through. The refitting period, which lasted perhaps 6 or 7 weeks, was also a time of relative normalcy that must have felt almost dreamlike to men who had spent the previous year in constant peril. There were supplies of food, regular meals instead of iron rations. There were opportunities to write letters home, though mail delivery was uncertain and growing more so as the Allies tightened their grip on occupied territory. There was time to wash, to sleep under a roof, to exist for a few hours without the acute awareness of mortal danger. Yet this interlude carried its own peculiar anxieties. Everyone knew that this was a temporary reprieve. Germany was losing the war. The defeats on all fronts were accelerating. How long could France remain a safe rear area? How long before the Americans and British broke out of Normandy and began a sustained drive eastward? The battles around Caen, only a few dozen kilometers away, were a constant reminder of how close the fighting had become. The Normandy campaign had been grinding on for nearly 2 months by the time the Hohenstaufen was withdrawing from the east. German forces were being slowly compressed into a pocket. Panzers that had been pulled back for rest were being committed to counterattacks and defensive stands. Supply lines were being throttled by Allied air superiority. Every German officer understood that the window of opportunity to stabilize the Western Front was closing. Yet the Hohenstaufen, in its refitting areas in the Netherlands and northern France, seemed for a moment to exist outside of time, in a suspended state between one catastrophe and the next. The division was theoretically at around 70% strength by early September, which is to say, it was still well below its full authorized capacity, but had enough cohesion and equipment to function as a fighting unit. New Panthers had arrived. The transport situation had improved. Ammunition and fuel were available in quantities that seemed almost lavish compared to the shortages of the Eastern Front. The men were cleaner, better fed, less visibly traumatized, though trauma of that depth does not simply fade away because circumstances improve. One might imagine, during those quiet weeks in late August and early September, that the division settled into a rhythm that felt almost normal: marching drills, equipment maintenance, unit cohesion exercises, the routines of military life that persist even in the midst of worldwide conflict. What nobody knew, what could not have been known with certainty, was that this moment of rebuilding and relative peace was about to be shattered. The very location that had seemed safe, that had been chosen partly because it was perceived as a quiet area for rest and retraining, would soon become one of the focal points of one of the most audacious military operations of the entire war. The Hohenstaufen had withdrawn from the chaos of the Eastern Front and had been deposited, almost accidentally, in a place where it would play a crucial role in determining the outcome of Operation Market Garden. The soldiers resting in their barracks and maintenance depots, unaware of what was about to unfold, were about to have their brief interlude shattered by the arrival of thousands of airborne troops descending from the sky. The division that had clawed its way back from the Ukraine found itself, in the spring of 1944, preparing for what would become one of the most punishing campaigns of the entire war. The men of Hohenstaufen, many of them still raw, many of them bearing the deep exhaustion of the Eastern Front in their eyes, were being rebuilt, reformed, equipped anew with newer Panther tanks to replace those lost in the grinding mud of Tarnopol and beyond. They were moved into assembly areas in Normandy in late May, positioned around the Caen sector, which would prove to be one of the most contested landscapes in Western Europe during the summer of 1944. When the Allied invasion came, in the grey light of dawn on the 6th of June, Hohenstaufen was not immediately engaged. The division's role, as the initial shockwaves of Operation Overlord rippled across the beaches, would be as a mobile reserve, a formation held ready to counterattack once the scope of the landings became clear. And yet what became immediately evident as the days progressed was that the war in Normandy would not be a war of rapid maneuver and decisive armor engagements in the manner that the German High Command had trained for and imagined. It would instead be a war of attrition, of constant pressure from the air and sea, of artillery barrages that seemed to never truly cease. The Caen sector, in particular, became a crucible. Hohenstaufen was committed to operations in and around the city beginning in mid-June, when the division engaged with British forces advancing inland from the beaches. What had been a countryside of bocage, dense hedgerows, sunken lanes, small villages built of stone that seemed designed by nature and history to favour the defender, became, over the course of weeks, a landscape transformed by bombardment. Fields that had been green were scorched black. Hedgerows were pulverized. Villages became rubble-scattered killing grounds, where infantry fought with desperate intensity. The panzer crews of Hohenstaufen found themselves facing a form of warfare that was, in many ways, more terrifying than direct combat. It was not so much the British and Canadian tanks and infantry that posed the greatest threat, though they were formidable opponents. It was, rather, the overwhelming superiority in air power that the Allies possessed. Imagine being the commander of a Panther tank, a machine that cost the Reich enormous resources and represented the cutting edge of armored warfare, and knowing that at any moment, while moving through a village, while repositioning through open ground, while attempting to concentrate forces for a counterattack, you might hear the sound of aircraft engines overhead. You might see, in those final seconds, the glint of wings, and then the world would cease to exist. The toll was staggering. The Allies had achieved, by June of 1944, air superiority that was nearly absolute. The Luftwaffe, hobbled by fuel shortages and the cumulative losses of years of combat, could barely offer meaningful resistance. German armor, for perhaps the first time in the war, was being used not as the dominant weapon system on the battlefield, but as something almost defensive: mobile strongpoints, anti-tank positions, desperate attempts to hold ground against an enemy that could call down destruction from the sky almost at will. Historical records indicate that Hohenstaufen lost a significant proportion of its tank strength during the Normandy campaign. Some estimates suggest that by late July, the division had sustained losses of between 40 and 50% of its armoured vehicles. These were not losses in the dramatic sense of a great battle lost in a single day, though there were certainly intense engagements. Rather, they accumulated. A tank destroyed by a rocket-firing Typhoon, another knocked out by British Sherman tanks in the Bocage near Villers-Bocage, a Panther immobilized by artillery, then abandoned by its crew and later destroyed, a self-propelled gun caught in the open during an air raid, another tank bogged down in mud and abandoned. The mathematics of attrition, operating across days and weeks, were relentless. The psychological impact on the crews cannot be understated, though it is sometimes overlooked in accounts that focus primarily on the mechanical aspects of warfare. A soldier can endure danger when he feels he has some agency in facing it, but to be repeatedly attacked from above, to see your comrades disintegrated by a bomb that fell from the sky while you were unable to fire back, unable to take cover, unable to do anything but wait and hope, this produces a particular kind of strain, a particular kind of exhaustion that goes beyond mere physical fatigue. The artillery, too, was relentless. The Allies, with their vast industrial capacity and their secure supply lines running back to their beachheads and then across the Channel, could afford to use artillery in a manner that was almost profligate by German standards. In the Eastern Front, ammunition was rationed, targeted carefully, used to achieve specific tactical objectives. In Normandy, the Allies could and did saturate areas with shells, bombardments that lasted for hours, that flattened everything within their range. German commanders learned to adapt, to concentrate their forces in small areas, to use movement and tactical flexibility to avoid the worst of the barrages. But adaptation has its limits when you are facing an enemy with material superiority measured in multiples. By late July, Hohenstaufen was being pulled back from the line, not in retreat, not yet, but to be refitted and, to some degree, to recover from the losses and the strain of nearly 2 months of nearly continuous combat. The men who had survived were harder, leaner, quieter than they had been before. Many of them harbored a new kind of awareness, a cold understanding that the circumstances of the war had fundamentally shifted. The Panzer divisions that had once ranged freely across European battlefields, striking when and where they chose, were now increasingly reactive, responding to Allied moves, fighting on terrain chosen by their enemies, sustaining losses that could not easily be replaced. Hohenstaufen's experience in Normandy was, in this sense, emblematic of a broader transformation in the nature of German warfare. The vision of lightning war, of rapid maneuver and decisive breakthroughs, was giving way to something grimmer and more static, a war of attrition fought under conditions of material and air superiority that the Germans could not match. The division would soon find itself positioned in a place where, almost by accident, it would have a chance to conduct the kind of sharp, organized counterattack that its commanders had trained for. But that opportunity, in the fields and towns around Arnhem, would come at a moment when the broader strategic situation was already tilting decisively against Germany, and when even the most skillful tactical actions could do little to alter the trajectory of the war as a whole. By the early summer of 1944, the Allied command structure across Western Europe had begun to face a peculiar and unforgiving mathematics. The Normandy beachhead, now firmly established but still constrained by the hedgerows and Norman bocage, had consumed divisions and resources at a rate that few planners had anticipated, even those who had wargamed the operation exhaustively in the months before. Eisenhower and his subordinates, Montgomery, Bradley, the Americans pressing inland while the British and Canadians held the northern flank, found themselves in a curious position. They were winning, undeniably winning, yet the pace of breakthrough remained frustratingly slow, measured in miles per week, rather than the dramatic exploitation that armored doctrine had long promised. The Germans, for their part, understood something that would become clearer with each passing week. They could not hold Normandy indefinitely. The sheer weight of American and British industry, the seemingly endless stream of tanks, guns, ammunition, and men flowing from across the Channel, would eventually overwhelm any static defense. And so, in the high command at Berlin and in the field headquarters scattered across France, the only rational option appeared to be a fighting withdrawal, a strategic retreat that might preserve enough force to establish a defensive line further east, perhaps along the Seine, perhaps beyond. But withdrawal, in the context of the Nazi war effort, was always more than a simple operational matter. It was ideological. It was humiliating, and it required decisions that could only be made at the highest levels. Divisions like Hohenstaufen, battered and depleted after their ordeal in the east, were pulled back from the line not merely to rest, though rest they desperately needed. They were being reconstituted, rebuilt into the kind of mobile striking force that the German High Command believed, or perhaps hoped, would be more precise, could still achieve something decisive on the continent. The broader Allied picture in those weeks between late June and August was one of incremental territorial gain, shadowed by the knowledge that speed, in warfare, carries its own strategic weight. Every day that the Allies spent grinding through Norman villages was a day in which German industry continued to function, in which the Luftwaffe, however diminished, might gather strength, in which new divisions could be raised and equipped. Conversely, every breakthrough threatened to trap German forces, to create opportunities for encirclement and annihilation. The tension between these two imperatives, the desire for caution against the pressure for speed, animated every operational decision. Montgomery's strategy, broadly speaking, was to maintain pressure on the British and Canadian fronts, while allowing the Americans to swing wide, to build a numerical advantage that would eventually allow for a breakout into open country. It required the acceptance that Normandy would not be rapidly conquered, but rather carefully, methodically cleared. The Americans, particularly, chafed against this approach. There was a cultural current in American military thinking, descended perhaps from the vast distances of the American continent itself, that valued rapid maneuver and encirclement over grinding attritional warfare. And this tension, between the methodical British approach and the more aggressive American preference, would shape not only the campaign in France, but the very decisions that would lead, in late August and early September, to the most audacious and ultimately tragic airborne operation of the war. Consider, for a moment, the logistics of this continental campaign. A single American infantry division required, by 1944, approximately 300 tons of supplies per day merely to exist in the field. Add ammunition, fuel, replacement vehicles, and the machinery of modern war balloons to numbers that strain imagination even now. The port of Cherbourg, when finally captured, could only handle a fraction of what was needed. The Mulberry harbours, those temporary, artificial ports constructed from steel and concrete, functioned as designed, but their capacity remained constrained. Eisenhower and his logisticians understood that every mile advanced inland was a mile that supply trucks had to travel, every mile that shortened supply lines by that same distance if forces could be extracted and redirected. German divisions pulled back for rest and refitting then were not merely tactical choices but responses to a strategic dilemma. A division refitting in the French interior was a division that was not tying down Allied forces in static defense, but it was also a division that might, given opportunity and concentration, be used for counterattack. The Germans had long believed in the power of the counteroffensive, in the notion that concentrated armor could yet pierce through and disrupt Allied plans. Whether this was realistic or merely reflected the desperation of a regime that could no longer afford to lose territory is, perhaps, a question best left to analysis. But the impulse was real, and divisions like Hohenstaufen, being rebuilt to full strength, represented at least the theoretical possibility that Germany might yet mount a blow that would alter the calculus. There exists a certain melancholy in studying the decisions of this period. The Allies, despite their overwhelming advantage, could never fully relax into their superiority. There was always the fear of the hidden enemy, the concentration of armor somewhere in the French interior that might suddenly strike. The Germans, meanwhile, could never fully accept the mathematical reality of their situation. They continued to believe, at the highest levels of command, that through will, through tactical brilliance, through the mobilization of remaining reserves, something might yet be salvaged. Neither side could afford the luxury of certainty. Both operated in a fog of intelligence, in a landscape where divisions like Hohenstaufen could still be dangerous, still needed to be accounted for, still posed the possibility of disruption. By the end of August, the situation had begun to clarify, at least somewhat. The Falaise pocket had formed and was being closed, trapping significant German forces in what would become one of the most catastrophic German defeats of the war. The possibility of a German counteroffensive, never very high, had essentially evaporated, and yet it was precisely in this moment of apparent German collapse that the Allies began to believe that the war in France might be decided not through the slow grinding warfare of Normandy, but through a bold stroke of maneuver. The very divisions that had been resting and refitting, hidden in the forests and villages of the French interior, were about to become, quite suddenly and without warning, the instruments of their own salvation and the agents of Allied disappointment. By the summer of 1944, the 9th SS Hohenstaufen Division had been quietly reassembled in France, gathering strength in the quiet countryside south and southeast of Paris. The men were tired, though less depleted than they might have been. New equipment had arrived. Training schedules had resumed their former rhythm. There was, in those weeks, a strange kind of peace, the peace of an exhausted unit given time to breathe, to oil its weapons, to remember what it meant to function as a coherent whole rather than as fragments scattered across burning terrain. The German High Command, in its calculations during late August and early September, had decided that the Hohenstaufen Division, along with its sister unit, the 10th SS Panzer Division Frundsberg, required further rest and consolidation. Both divisions had suffered grievously in the east, and then again during the chaos of the Normandy fighting and the subsequent German retreat from France. A strategic decision was made, almost matter-of-factly in the surviving records, to position these panzer formations in a region that seemed, on paper, both safe and useful. That region was the area around Arnhem and Nijmegen in the Dutch province of Gelderland, in the eastern Netherlands, not far from the German border. It is worth pausing here to consider what Arnhem represented in the minds of German planners at that moment. The area was considered relatively quiet. It sat behind the main lines of the collapsing German front, yet close enough to the fighting that reserves could theoretically be deployed if needed. The roads were good. The terrain was manageable. There were barracks and billets available. To the German command structure, this was a logical choice, a rest area with some capacity to respond to emergencies, but primarily a place to rebuild. What made this positioning so historically consequential, and what lends it an almost dreamlike quality when examined in hindsight, is how little this decision was known to Allied intelligence. The vast machinery of Allied reconnaissance, the aerial photographs, the radio intercepts, the prisoner interrogations, had somehow failed to locate or confirm the presence of these two panzer divisions in the Arnhem sector. There were vague reports, certainly. There were suspicions. But there was no concrete intelligence, no hard evidence photographed from the air, no clear understanding among the planners of Operation Market Garden that two relatively fresh SS Panzer divisions were resting, refitting, and preparing for training exercises barely a few kilometers from the very zones where British airborne forces were about to land. One might ask why this particular gap in intelligence existed. The answer is not dramatic or singular. It was partly a matter of concentration. The Allies' aerial reconnaissance had been focused on the coastal areas, on the major German concentrations to the south and east. It was partly a matter of luck, of German security measures being unexpectedly effective in this particular instance. It was partly because panzer divisions, when resting, scatter their vehicles and personnel in villages and forests, rather than massing them in obvious concentrations. A single Tiger tank tucked into a farmyard, covered with branches and netting, is nearly invisible from 20,000 feet. Dozens of such vehicles, distributed across dozens of small communities, become statistically harder to spot, even with the most diligent reconnaissance. By early September, then, the Hohenstaufen Division found itself positioned in a landscape of low visibility. Invisible, it seemed, to the enemy, though present and waiting. The soldiers themselves were largely unaware of the historical moment gathering around them. They had no sense that they were about to become a footnote to one of the war's most dramatic and tragic episodes. They cleaned weapons. They attended training classes in which officers reminded them of panzer tactics, of discipline under fire, of the importance of concentrating armor at the crucial moment. They wrote letters home. They exchanged gossip about when they might next see combat, or whether they might, by some miracle of military fate, be rested here through the winter. The division was spread across a network of villages and towns throughout the region. Some elements were stationed near Arnhem itself. Others were positioned slightly to the north, near Oosterbeek and Heelsum. Others still were grouped around Zutphen and farther east. The dispersal was partly deliberate, a response to the ever-present threat of Allied air attack. Large concentrations of vehicles and men were suicide under the conditions of air superiority that prevailed over Northern Europe in 1944. So the division fragmented itself, in a sense, across the gentle landscape, becoming less visible but also less immediately concentrated, a strategic choice that would prove both protective and, in its own way, tragically limiting when the moment of crisis arrived. What is perhaps most striking about this positioning, when one contemplates it from the vantage point of the present, is the quality of chance embedded within it. A decision by high command to rest the division in a particular location. A failure of Allied intelligence to confirm the presence of panzer forces in that location. A historical collision set to occur, unknown to either side, in a matter of days. These were not grand strategic plans, not the result of deep foresight or brilliant deception. They were, rather, the ordinary functioning of military bureaucracy meeting the ordinary failures of reconnaissance and intelligence. All of it arranged against a backdrop of genuine uncertainty and the fog that always surrounds warfare. The men who filled the ranks of Hohenstaufen during these September days, many of them young, many of them conscripts rather than ideological volunteers, had no premonition of what awaited them. They moved through the Dutch landscape with the curious double awareness that all soldiers in rest areas develop, simultaneous gratitude for the reprieve and anxiety about what comes next. They attended evening meals. They smoked cigarettes. They wondered, perhaps, whether they would see home again, though few of them, one suspects, could have articulated that wondering clearly, even to themselves. The river landscape around Arnhem is soft and gentle, studded with water meadows and tree-lined banks. In early September, the weather was turning. The bright heat of summer was beginning to give way to cooler mornings and longer shadows. The fields were golden. There was, to anyone looking from the outside, no sense of impending violence. Yet within this calm, nearly invisible landscape, the Hohenstaufen Division waited. Its tanks sat hidden, its soldiers slept in barns and billets, its officers studied maps and wrote reports, and in its cumulative silence, it became the instrument of historical accident, a force positioned perfectly, by chance, to disrupt one of the most ambitious military operations of the entire war. In the early hours of Sunday, September 17, 1944, an extraordinary sound began to fill the skies above the Netherlands. It was not the roar of fighters or bombers, though those would come in waves throughout the day, but something altogether different. The rhythmic, almost mechanical thrumming of hundreds of transport aircraft, their engines synchronized into a low drone that must have seemed to echo across the entire region, drawing the attention of every German soldier within earshot, and thousands of civilian eyes turned upward in confusion and fear. Operation Market Garden had begun. The largest airborne assault in history was unfolding across Dutch airspace, a bold gamble that had been planned for weeks in British and American command centers, refined through autumn nights, and now committed to the uncertain reality of execution. Nearly 5,000 aircraft and gliders were committed to this single operation, a staggering concentration of air power, of human intention, of hope and calculation. The plan was deceptively elegant in its conception, though as these things often are, more fragile in its execution than the planning maps suggested. Airborne troops would be dropped along a corridor that stretched from near the coast inland toward Arnhem, establishing what the planners called an airborne corridor, a series of lodgements that would serve as stepping stones for the advancing ground forces that would push northward from the south to relieve them. The first waves carried men of the American 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions into the southern portions of the operational area. These were troops who had tasted combat already in Normandy just 3 months prior. They carried that experience with them, along with the memory of losses, the knowledge of how quickly a well-laid plan could unravel when it encountered actual resistance. Their objective was to secure crossing points, hold terrain, and maintain a foothold until ground forces could arrive. To the north, British and Polish airborne forces, elements of the 1st Airborne Corps, would undertake the most distant mission. They were to seize and hold Arnhem, specifically the bridge over the Rhine, that crucial crossing point that would unlock the entire northern approach to Germany. It was perhaps the most audacious element of the entire plan. Drop paratroopers more than 60 miles behind enemy lines, in an area where intelligence reports suggested German strength was minimal, and expect them to hold until relieved. The assumption, quietly accepted by those planning the operation, was that German forces in the area were weak, disorganized, perhaps recovering from their recent losses in France. This assumption would prove to be one of the most consequential intelligence failures of the entire campaign. For somewhere in the forests and villages surrounding Arnhem, elements of the 9th SS Panzer Division Hohenstaufen were, at precisely that moment, preparing for routine movements. They were resting, refitting, drawing supplies, and conducting training with new replacements. The men were tired, genuinely exhausted in that bone-deep way that soldiers understand after months of combat. But they were also still coherent as a fighting force. Their vehicles were being repaired and maintained. Their officers and non-commissioned officers, the backbone of any military unit, were intact. In a matter of hours, many of these men would hear the same sound that was drawing attention across the region. They would hear those transport engines. Some might have felt a chill of foreboding. Others might have experienced something closer to relief, a sense that action, any action, was preferable to the exhausting uncertainty of waiting. The collision between two vast machines of war, one descending from the sky and one rooted in the earth below, was about to occur almost by accident. Neither side was fully prepared for the other's presence. The Allies did not know that battle-hardened panzer troops would be waiting for them. The Germans were surprised by the scale and precision of the airborne assault, though as professional soldiers they would adapt with that grim efficiency that characterized the Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS at their most dangerous. By late afternoon, the drops were largely complete. Men were gathering equipment, forming up units, and beginning to move toward their objectives. In the southern zones, where the American airborne had landed, the process of establishing control and preparing defensive positions had begun in earnest. But it was to the north, at Arnhem, where the most intense confrontation would develop. The British 1st Airborne Division, under the command of General Roy Urquhart, had landed with approximately 9,000 men. Their immediate objective was straightforward: secure the bridge. The bridge itself, the John Frost Bridge, named after a British general but known simply as the Rhine crossing to the troops who would fight for it, represented the key to the entire operation. Without it, the airborne corridor would be severed. The possibility of relief and breakout would evaporate. But here was where geography and circumstance conspired to create difficulty. The zones designated for the parachute drops and glider landings were several kilometers away from the bridge itself. The terrain between the drop zones and Arnhem was intersected by canals, roads, and small villages, each of which might serve as a point of resistance. And moving through that terrain, gathering scattered paratroopers, reorganizing units that had landed scattered across a wide area, all of this required time. It required coordination. It required luck. The British planners had accepted these risks because the alternative, landing closer to the bridge, would have meant dropping men directly on or very near German defensive positions. The compromise seemed reasonable enough at the planning table. What the planners did not adequately account for was the presence of Hohenstaufen. As the afternoon light began to fade on that 17th of September, German commanders were already reacting. General Wilhelm Bittrich, commanding the SS Panzer Corps, which included both the 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions, was receiving reports of the landings. His immediate response was to begin organizing his scattered forces for counterattack. The 9th SS Hohenstaufen began to move. Tank crews who had been resting in the shade of workshops and maintenance areas scrambled to their vehicles. Infantry sections which had been scattered across training grounds and rest areas were gathered. The machinery of war, which had seemed dormant just hours before, came alive once more. The stage was set, then, for one of the most remarkable engagements of the entire European campaign. Two forces, one tired but still formidable, one arriving from the sky with limited heavy weapons and uncertain supply, were converging on the same piece of territory. The British paratroopers did not yet fully understand what they faced. Some German commanders were still assessing the scale of the landings, still attempting to determine whether this was the main blow or a diversion. But the collision was now inevitable, and in the streets of Arnhem and in the smaller villages scattered throughout the polder landscape surrounding the city, the real test of Operation Market Garden was about to begin. The bridge itself was a structure of Victorian engineering, built decades before, in more peaceful times, when the Rhine crossing at Arnhem served commerce and ordinary travellers. Steel and stone, pragmatic Dutch work, spanning perhaps 400 metres from the northern ramp to the southern bank, where the town proper began. By the second week of September, this bridge had become the still point around which the entire operation pivoted. The geographic fact that neither the British planners nor the German defenders could escape. The British Second Army needed it intact. The Germans, realizing what was slipping through their fingers, needed it destroyed or held. And so the bridge became a sort of tragic magnet, drawing in combat photographers, soldiers with orders impossible to fully execute, and the accumulated weight of a desperate gamble about to collide with unexpected reality. Picture, if you will, the northern approaches as the first paratroops began their push toward the ramps. The landing zones were several kilometers north and east, which meant movement through suburbs, through streets lined with Dutch houses built in the close, orderly style of the Netherlands, their windows already dark and curtained by civilians who sensed that something grave was happening. The roads were narrow. The Hohenstaufen Panzer Grenadiers, still somewhat exhausted from their recent refitting in the French countryside, held positions that had materialized almost by accident. They were not dug in with the formality of a prepared defense. Rather, they occupied buildings, street corners, the sorts of vantage points that a trained, disciplined unit recognizes instinctively as useful when battle finds you without warning. The town of Arnhem itself became, in those early daylight hours, a place where two military logics collided, the British advancing with the confidence of men who believed air superiority and surprise were with them, the Germans reacting with the practiced efficiency of soldiers who had survived thousands of kilometers of warfare and knew how to establish a defensive line even when circumstances were against them. The streets near the bridge approach were not wide. This mattered tremendously. Tanks, which the Germans had in modest number, could not maneuver easily through narrow passages. Men on foot, the grenadiers, the British paratroopers, became the primary instruments of battle. A German soldier might crouch behind a stone wall, fire across the street into an upper window where a British soldier had taken position. The British returned fire from doorways, from behind rubble, from rooftops where they could establish enfilade. It was urban combat, which is among the most exhausting and consuming forms of warfare, because every space, every wall, every window becomes a tactical problem. There is no rest, no moment where the mind can truly relax, because threat emerges from multiple directions and from spaces one cannot see directly. The wearing effect on human nerves and bodies was immense. The rubble accumulated as the fighting progressed. Artillery fire from both sides pulverized buildings. The British were calling in support from guns south of the river. The Germans were using mortars and what anti-tank guns they could position. Dust hung in the air, mingling with smoke, creating a haze that made distance difficult to judge and visibility a constant problem. Soldiers on both sides reported that the dust made it hard to see more than 30 or 40 meters ahead. The world compressed into intimate spaces, a street corner, a house interior, the space between buildings. A soldier could fight for hours without seeing a clear sight line of more than the length of a city block. One might wonder, how do men continue, in such conditions, knowing that advancing toward the bridge means walking into concentrated fire? The answer involves a mixture of training, discipline, obedience to orders, and a kind of weariness that paradoxically can push soldiers forward. They were tired, many of them, particularly the Germans who had been engaged for weeks on end. But tired men still follow orders. Tired men still fire their weapons. Tired men still advance when their sergeant says to advance. The British paratroopers, though fresher to the immediate battle, were also burdened with the knowledge that they had landed far from their actual objectives. The parachute drops had been scattered. some units landing miles from where they were meant to be, and they were pushing toward objectives with incomplete forces and partial knowledge of what they faced. Exhaustion and confusion are close cousins. By the afternoon of the first day, the northern part of Arnhem itself had become a landscape of contested blocks, of ambush positions and suppressing fire. The Hohenstaufen Grenadiers, commanded by careful officers and non-commissioned officers, maintained discipline even as their situation grew grimmer. They understood that they held the bridge, or at least the northern approaches to it, and that holding it was now their primary purpose. The British understood that they needed it, and that every hour without it was an hour in which the strategic window was closing. Neither side had overwhelming numbers in this initial phase. It was a question of who could concentrate force in the right place at the right moment, who could sustain effort despite fatigue and confusion, who could maintain command and control in the chaos of house-to-house combat. The bridge itself, during these early hours, remained largely a physical structure waiting. Engineers on both sides were aware that it existed, that it mattered, that it represented the hinge upon which the entire operation's success turned. But the bridge could not defend itself. It would be defended or taken by men with rifles, by men throwing grenades into windows, by men pressing forward through streets, where the next corner might hold a German machine gun position, or the next building might conceal a squad with anti-tank weapons. The bridge was the destination, the objective on every map and every order. But it remained, during these first hours, something glimpsed distantly, something known about, but not yet directly experienced by most of the men fighting for it. As darkness approached, the rhythm of the battle took on a different character. The initial surprise had worn away. Both sides had begun to understand, at least partially, what faced them. The Germans had committed more reinforcements, pulling them from other parts of their scattered and incomplete defensive positions. The British had consolidated their scattered units as much as possible and continued pushing south. It was becoming clear, even in those early hours, that this was not going to be the swift, almost ceremonial capture that the planners in England had perhaps imagined. The bridge was becoming a destination that would require sustained effort, that would exact a price, that would involve not just the opening moments of airborne triumph, but days of grinding, attritional combat in a confined urban space. The perimeter around Oosterbeek was never meant to hold. It was a shrinking ring drawn by exhausted men who knew, with increasing certainty, that they would not be relieved. The British 1st Airborne had landed with the assumption that 20th Corps would push through Arnhem within 48 hours, perhaps 72 at most, but the bridge was gone, held by a force they could not dislodge, and the relief columns moved through a landscape that seemed to grow more hostile with each passing hour. By the time the survivors of the fighting in Arnhem began filtering back westward across the Nieder Rhine, the perimeter contracted into something resembling a small fortress, a medieval concept made modern, held by men with depleting ammunition and radio batteries that would not last. Oosterbeek itself was a residential suburb, tree-lined streets, comfortable houses with gardens, the kind of place where the war had seemed, until that September week, somewhat distant. Now those houses became strongpoints. Basements became fighting positions. Brick walls that had sheltered families from ordinary weather became bulletproof cover only by the most optimistic definition. The Germans, by contrast, held the higher ground to the north and east, a slight elevation that in normal military circumstances might seem negligible, but in urban fighting with dwindling ammunition, every meter of advantage mattered. They controlled the roads leading out of the perimeter, and they had vehicles, artillery support, and the immense advantage of being able to retreat. The British could not retreat, they could only hold. The toll this exacted was quiet and relentless. The Medical Corps established an aid station in the basement of the Hartenstein Hotel, which would become the divisional headquarters. Wounded men began arriving almost immediately, some from Arnhem, some from the perimeter itself, and as the days progressed, the basement filled past capacity. Men lay on stretchers, on blankets on the floor, in every available space. The medical officers worked with decreasing supplies of morphine, bandages that had to be boiled and reused, and the knowledge that evacuation was impossible. What does one tell a wounded soldier when help cannot come? The regimental aid men, the stretcher bearers, the doctors themselves operated in a state somewhere between professional dedication and a kind of numb endurance. Some men died from wounds that, only days earlier and miles away, might have been survivable. The German forces surrounding the perimeter were not endless, though they seemed so. The 9th SS Hohenstaufen, recovering from its own losses, did not have unlimited strength. But what they possessed was the ability to reorganize, to bring in reinforcements from other sectors, to concentrate their force where pressure was needed. There was a grinding quality to the German attacks, less the fluid counterattack of earlier campaigns, more the careful, methodical reduction of a defensive position. They probed the perimeter, tested its strength, withdrew to regroup. They brought in engineers to clear rubble and create assault routes. They brought in field guns to methodically crater the roads and destroy the brick fortifications from a distance. For those defending, each day seemed to bring a new orientation of attack, a new direction from which shells arrived. The British soldiers themselves, Poles too, for the Polish Independent Parachute Brigade had also been surrounded, were in a state that contemporary accounts describe with careful understatement. Exhausted is a word, but it was something deeper than the ordinary fatigue of combat. They had been told they were part of an operation that would end the war by Christmas, or at least shorten it considerably. They had been dropped into what was presented as a strategic masterstroke, and now they found themselves trapped, running low on ammunition, unable to break out, increasingly aware that the relieving forces might not arrive in time. There is a particular psychological weight to that realization. The moment when hope has not died but becomes contingent depends on things you cannot control, people not yet aware of your predicament. Water became a concern. The perimeter had access to some wells, but as the fighting progressed and the number of wounded increased, water became precious. Food supplies dwindled. The airborne had been dropped with rations intended for a few days. Now those rations were being stretched across longer periods, divided among more people, the soldiers themselves, the wounded, the civilians still trapped in the houses within the perimeter. Here and there, a house had been evacuated, but others still held civilians who refused to leave or who were sheltering in basements and hoped the fighting would move away. The soldiers felt the weight of that too, the knowledge that their defensive positions, their use of buildings as strongpoints, meant that the civilians lived in constant danger. Artillery did not discriminate. Neither did machine gun fire if it had to pass through a wall to reach its target. On the German side, there was also weariness, though of a different character. The Hohenstaufen Division was rebuilding, remember, recovering from losses on the Eastern Front and in Normandy. The men who arrived to contain the Oosterbeek perimeter were not a fresh force arriving for glory. They were soldiers who had already experienced significant losses, and now they were being asked to methodically reduce a defensive position held by paratroopers who, whatever else could be said about them, were trained soldiers with nothing to lose and everything to prove. The German officers controlling the operation had orders to eliminate the British position, but they also had limited resources, limited time. The broader strategic situation on all fronts was deteriorating. There was a sense, not quite articulated but felt, that time was working against Germany in a fundamental way. Night brought a kind of reprieve, though not rest. In darkness, patrols moved between positions. Wounded men cried out softly, asking for water, for mothers, for reassurance that someone was still there, still awake. still human in the darkness. The aid station workers moved between them quietly, knowing that there was nothing more they could do. Supply drops by the RAF attempted to reach the perimeter, but many of the supplies fell outside the shrinking perimeter or were destroyed by artillery fire before they could be retrieved. Those supplies that did arrive, ammunition primarily, some medical supplies, were shared according to a calculus that became starker each day. How much ammunition remains? How many wounded? How long might this position need to hold? The mathematics of desperation. There was also, woven through the exhaustion and the fear, moments of profound humanity that later accounts tend to emphasize, perhaps because such moments seem necessary to remember in the face of what cannot be forgotten. A German soldier helping to carry wounded men to the aid station, working alongside his British counterparts for a moment, and then returning to his position. A shared cigarette at a momentary truce to collect the dead. A small child being helped from a basement, guided by soldiers from both sides towards safety. These are not the main narrative of battle, but they are part of its texture, the small rebellions against the logic of killing that occurred almost despite the war itself. By the 4th and 5th days, the British position was running critically low on ammunition. The perimeter had been further compressed, the ring drawn tighter. There was now discussion, urgent but quiet, about whether the position could be held at all, whether remaining meant only delaying death rather than surviving. The decision to withdraw across the Nieder-Rhine began to form not as a military maneuver, but as a grim acknowledgement of reality. The operation had failed. The bridge was in German hands. Relief was not coming. And now, perhaps, the only duty left was to preserve what men remained, to save them from a position that could no longer be defended. The human cost of Oosterbeek was measured not only in the immediate casualties, the men killed and wounded in the fighting itself, but in the weight of the decision, in the recognition that this operation, however brilliant its conception, had encountered a reality it had not anticipated. The Hohenstaufen Division, that rebuilding force that had survived Ukraine and Normandy, had stumbled into a defensive victory simply by being in the right place at the wrong time. And the men of the 1st Airborne, paratroopers trained for a different kind of war, found themselves ground down by an enemy that, though weakening overall, was still capable of grinding. That is how modern wars often end in their smaller moments. Not with glory or strategic triumph, but with exhaustion meeting exhaustion, with the slow realization that what was promised cannot be delivered, and what remains must simply be endured until it is finally over. The weight of a great battle settles differently than most people imagine. There is no sudden silence. The guns do not all stop at once. Instead, they taper. The artillery fire that has hammered the earth for days becomes sporadic, then rare. Small arms crackle briefly in distant streets. By the morning of September 26th, just 10 days after the first gliders descended into the fields around Arnhem, something resembling quiet had returned to the lower Rhine Valley, and that quiet itself was its own kind of sound, a vacuum where chaos had been, a pressure that made the stillness feel almost like a wound. The 9th SS Hohenstaufen had paid a terrible price for their victory, if victory was even the right word for what had occurred. In those 9 or 10 days of fighting, the division had sustained losses that marked a threshold, not merely the loss of men and machines, which was grave enough, but a loss of coherence, of the kind of unit integrity that armies require to function. The exact figures are difficult to pin down with absolute precision, as is often true in the immediate aftermath of mechanized warfare, but accounts suggest that Hohenstaufen suffered somewhere in the region of 2,000 casualties, possibly more. Some of those were killed, others wounded, still others missing in the confusion of dispersed fighting across villages and riversides. For a division that had arrived in the Arnhem region with strength weakened by prior campaigns, These losses were not merely significant, they were hollowing. Tank losses were substantial too, though exact numbers remain sources of historical debate. The division had entered the operation with roughly 150 tanks and assault guns at varying degrees of readiness. How many remained in any condition for further operations is a question that historians answer differently depending on the sources they weight. What mattered more than the precise accounting, perhaps, was the psychological texture of these losses. These were men who had survived the grinding attrition of the Eastern Front, who had been withdrawn from France because the Normandy campaign had already worn them thin, who had been promised a period of rest and reorganization that had been interrupted by the sudden appearance of British and Polish paratroopers. Now, in the strange autumn light of late September, they watched their comrades being loaded onto trucks and carried to field hospitals. They surveyed the damage to their armor, and they began, slowly, uncertainly, to grasp that the war they had been fighting was not moving in a direction they had been led to expect. There is something uniquely disorienting about that moment, when the momentum of a campaign that seemed to be going well suddenly reverses, when certainty becomes doubt, when the narrative you have been told about inevitable German strength begins to crack at its foundations. The British withdrawal was itself a strange kind of operation, neither quite a rout nor an orderly retreat, but something suspended between the two. The paratroopers who had held the perimeter around Oosterbeek, particularly those of the 1st Airborne Division, had been fighting without adequate supplies, with dwindling ammunition, with wounded accumulating in cellars and schoolhouses, with the river at their back as both an escape route and a trap. By the time the decision was made to withdraw them across the Rhine, a decision that seems to have been reached with considerable reluctance by commanders who had hoped, until nearly the last moment, that the ground forces would break through and relieve them, they were in a state of exhaustion that is almost difficult to imagine. Soldiers who had been awake, alert, and fighting for days on end, in conditions of constant danger, without enough food, with fear and pain as constant companions, do not withdraw in military formation. They move almost like sleepwalkers, following paths through the darkness, crossing the river in small boats and assault craft, guided by whispers and the pressure of hands on their shoulders. The actual withdrawal, conducted on the night of September 25th into the 26th, was a quiet affair, necessarily. No explosions, no massed gunfire to cover the retreat. Instead, there was an agreement of sorts, a kind of informal truce that emerged from the exhaustion of both sides. The German soldiers, having pressed their advantage for days, seemed to have been content to let the British leave. Whether this was deliberate mercy or simply the result of battlefield fatigue on both sides is unknowable. Perhaps 5,000 British and Polish paratroopers made it across the river to safety. Another 2,000 were left behind, taken prisoner, many of them wounded. The Germans, having won the tactical battle, controlled the ground and the river crossing. What was strange, in the aftermath, was not the victory itself, but the sense of incompleteness that seemed to accompany it. The Germans had stopped Operation Market Garden. There was no disputing that. They had held the Arnhem crossing. The British had not broken through to link up with their airborne forces. Strategically, the great envelopment that Montgomery had hoped for was impossible. And yet, what had been stopped? An attempt to end the war with a sudden, spectacular operation. A plan that, had it succeeded, might have shortened the conflict significantly. That failure was important, undeniably so. But did it feel like a turning point to the German soldiers who had fought for it? Did it seem, in those quiet days after the battle, like the kind of victory that changes the course of a war? The historical record suggests otherwise. The period immediately following Arnhem was one of withdrawal, reorganization, and a kind of sober reckoning on both sides. For the Germans, it meant pulling back, counting losses, assessing what remained operational and what needed to be rebuilt. For the Allies, It meant acknowledging that the war would not end this year, that Germany would not be defeated before winter, that the long grind toward Berlin would be exactly as long as it appeared to be. The landscape around Arnhem and Oosterbeek, scarred by fighting, settled back into the rhythms of autumn. The ruins of buildings that had been destroyed, the gardens trampled by movement of men and vehicles, the fields torn by shells and tank tracks, all of this would remain for months and years as a reminder of those 9 days. What followed, in the larger context of the war in Western Europe, was a kind of stalemate that would persist until spring. The Germans held their ground in Holland. The Allies consolidated their positions south of the great rivers. Winter came. Supply lines stretched. Months of grinding, smaller battles followed, and the 9th SS Hohenstaufen, still battered from Arnhem, would find themselves pulled once more into the machinery of war, in directions they did not anticipate, toward conclusions that no amount of tactical victory could now prevent. The peculiar tragedy of Arnhem, when one examines it from the vantage point of decades and declassified documents, reveals less a story of German superiority and more a landscape of reasonable assumptions that converged into collective blindness. The Allied High Command, confident, exhausted, and operating under pressures we might struggle to fully inhabit today, possessed an almost understandable conviction that German armour in the Netherlands was negligible. After all, the scattered remnants of divisions shattered in Normandy had been pulled backward, reformed in quiet corners of occupied France, deliberately kept away from the anticipated thrust into the Low Countries. The logic seemed sound. Why would the enemy concentrate panzer strength where it was least expected to be needed? This assumption carried the weight of earlier successes. Throughout the summer of 1944, Allied air superiority and mechanized superiority had translated into battlefield dominance. German armor, when encountered, had been overcome. The photographs and reports flowing back to Montgomery's headquarters painted a picture of an enemy in managed decline, their capacity for coordinated counterattack diminished by attrition, supply shortages, and the sheer relentless pressure of operations on 2 major fronts. It is worth pausing here to consider that confidence, while sometimes dangerous, is also sometimes rational. The Allies had good reason to believe what they believed. Yet the intelligence networks, vast and well-resourced as they were, possessed certain structural blind spots. The Dutch underground, brave and ingenious, provided fragmentary reports of German movement and concentration. Some of these warnings did reach higher command. Notably, the British Second Army received intelligence indicating the presence of panzer formations near Arnhem. Formations being refitted, yes, but present nonetheless. The information was circulated. It reached General Bernard Montgomery. But how does one reconcile discrete intelligence with the broader operational narrative? How does one allow a single report, uncertain in its details, to unravel a comprehensive plan months in the making, consuming resources, involving thousands of lives already committed to movement? This is perhaps where the nature of command decision-making reveals itself most gently and most poignantly. Officers at every level must synthesize competing information, weigh certainties against possibilities, and commit to courses of action knowing that alternatives are foreclosed by the commitment itself. General Frederick Browning, commanding the Allied airborne forces, expressed reservations about the plan's boldness, particularly concerning the gap between the airborne landings and the advancing ground forces. But objections, when made against the current of momentum and authority, often dissipate. This was not catastrophic failure, it was, rather, the ordinary friction of warfare meeting the particular circumstances of optimism and time pressure. The intelligence failure, such as it was, contained a human dimension that might offer some small comfort in reflection. It was not corruption or negligence that created the blind spot. Rather, It was the inevitable limitation of any intelligence apparatus when faced with an enemy conducting deception and, frankly, when confronted with an operation so ambitious that it demanded belief in its own success. The planners of Market Garden had committed themselves to a narrative that swift movement, airborne audacity, and the collapse of German morale would combine to create a corridor into Germany itself. Contradictory intelligence, arriving in fragments and lacking the clarity of certainty, could be absorbed into this narrative, explained away as the usual background noise of warfare. Consider, too, the compression of time that military operations impose upon human cognition. Field commanders and their staffs were working with incomplete maps of enemy dispositions, radio intercepts that required interpretation, and the constant demands of moving vast mechanized formations across a continent still contested and treacherous. In such circumstances, the intelligence officer's estimate must compete with 100 other imperatives. Is it surprising that a report of German panzer elements in a quiet sector, elements that were theoretically in no condition to threaten a major operation, received less weight than it might have deserved in retrospect? The broader strategic picture, too, colored the interpretation of tactical intelligence. The Allies genuinely believed, and this belief was not without foundation, that the German army was in the process of collapse. The Eastern Front had consumed staggering German resources. The losses in Normandy had been catastrophic. Logically, Germany should have been unable to mount any serious opposition to a carefully orchestrated airborne operation. The deficiency in this reasoning lay not in its structure, but in its underestimation of German capacity for improvisation and resilience even in extremity. A division rebuilding its strength is not the same as a division incapable of fighting, and it is in this gap between theoretical assessment and actual capability that history often finds its turning points. There is a quieter observation to be made as well, one that carries less blame and more understanding. The Allies were, in September 1944, genuinely winning. The momentum of their victory was such that it created its own gravitational field, pulling all interpretation of events into alignment with the larger narrative of triumph in progress. To seriously entertain intelligence suggesting that a major operation might fail required a kind of cognitive independence that even careful commanders struggle to maintain when success is flowing around them. It is not an excuse. It is simply a recognition that the human mind, even when trained and disciplined, gravitates toward narratives that align with recent experience and visible momentum. The question that echoes softly through the historical record is whether Arnhem could have succeeded even with perfect intelligence. Had the Allied command known with absolute certainty that fresh panzer divisions were refitting within striking distance of the proposed airborne corridor, might they have modified the operation, chosen a different approach, accepted a less ambitious objective? Some historians suggest the operation might have proceeded anyway, for the momentum was too great, the commitment too complete, and the alternatives, at that moment in September, less attractive than the bold gamble. Others propose that knowledge of Hohenstaufen's presence, and of the 10th SS nearby, might have prompted either reinforcement of the airborne forces or a fundamental recalibration of the entire strategy. What we can say with certainty is that no intelligence failure, however lamentable, diminishes the courage of those who fought at Arnhem or the skill with which they conducted their defense in an impossible situation. The nature of command decisions, the pressure under which they are made, and the knowledge available at the moment of decision form a historical context that permits understanding without requiring vindication. The Allies were not stupid, they were not negligent in any simple sense. They operated within the constraints of imperfect information, time pressure, and the enormous momentum of an ongoing victory. History offers this observation not as excuse, but as reminder that clarity is always easier in retrospect than in the fog of operational command. In those autumn months following the disaster at Arnhem, the Hohenstaufen Division found itself in a curious state of exhaustion. The men who had fought through the dense bocage of Normandy, who had defended ground across Ukraine and Poland, who had clashed with British paratroopers in shattered Dutch streets, were now scattered across refitting areas in Belgium and northern France, their tanks being repaired, their ammunition stores replenished, their rosters slowly filling with replacements to cover the enormous losses of the summer campaign. There was a sense, perhaps, of temporary reprieve, a moment when the grinding machinery of war seemed to pause, if only briefly, before turning once more. But the pause would not last long. By late autumn, as the trees across the Low Countries shed their remaining leaves and the weather turned cold and damp, news began filtering down through the German command structure of something remarkable being prepared. In the dense forests of the Ardennes, far to the south, vast quantities of fuel were being stockpiled. Panzer divisions were being secretly concentrated. Plans were being drawn for a massive counter-offensive, a last great gamble to drive a wedge through the Allied lines, and, perhaps, to change the course of the war itself. The operation would be called the Ardennes Offensive, and for those who knew of it, it represented either a final hope or a final delusion, depending on one's perspective. The Hohenstaufen Division, by December 1944, was deemed fit enough for combat once more. Its strength had been restored to something approaching operational levels, though the quality of its replacements varied considerably. Some were seasoned soldiers, transferred from other units or recalled from rear areas. Many others were younger men, some having seen little combat, pressed into service as the manpower crisis deepened across the German Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS. The division was organized once again for offensive operations, concentrated in staging areas where troops were briefed on their objectives and the ambitious scope of the coming campaign. On the 16th of December 1944, beneath skies heavy with cloud that would shield the German advance from Allied air superiority, the Ardennes offensive began. The Hohenstaufen Division, along with other powerful armored formations, surged westward through the frozen landscape, seeking to exploit gaps in the American lines. For a few days, perhaps 5 or 6, the offensive seemed to possess real momentum. German armor pierced deeper into Belgium than many observers had thought possible. News of the breakthrough spread through the Allied command structure with alarm and urgency. Yet the operation, for all its initial gains, would ultimately fail to achieve its strategic objectives, held back by supply difficulties, by the weather clearing to allow Allied air attacks, and by American resilience in defending key road junctions. The Hohenstaufen Division, fighting in this campaign, suffered further losses in men and machines. The conditions were brutal, cold, mud, the constant threat of air attack, supply lines stretched dangerously thin. The division found itself engaged in a grinding campaign that consumed fuel and ammunition at rates that could not be replaced. As December turned into January, and as the weather improved and American and British air forces returned to the skies, the offensive lost its momentum entirely. The Hohenstaufen, along with other German panzer formations, was gradually pushed back, forced to retreat through the same snowy forests it had advanced through weeks before. And then, in a decision that spoke to the desperation of the Nazi regime's military planning, the exhausted Hohenstaufen Division was withdrawn from the Ardennes and redirected once more to the east. The Soviet offensive, which had begun in January 1945, was consuming German reserves at an even faster rate than the fighting in the west. Manpower, tanks, and trained officers were needed urgently on the Eastern Front, where the Red Army was now advancing into German territory itself, threatening Poland, East Prussia, and approaching the heartland of the Reich. The journey eastward was an ordeal in itself. Rail transport was subject to constant air attack. Roads were congested with retreating refugees and retreating military columns. When the division finally reassembled in its new operational area, somewhere in the murky battlefield between the Vistula River and the approaches to Silesia, it found itself part of a desperate attempt to stabilize a crumbling front. The men were tired, the machines were worn, replacements continued to arrive, but they were often poorly trained, sometimes conscripted from non-German sources, as the manpower situation became truly critical. The fighting on the Eastern Front in early 1945 was perhaps the most brutal warfare of the entire war. Here, in the frozen landscape of Poland and East Prussia, there was no such thing as rest or consolidation. The Soviet forces, numerically superior and supplied with seemingly endless quantities of men and material, attacked continuously. German divisions were engaged in a series of desperate defensive operations, fighting to delay the inevitable Soviet advance. The Hohenstaufen, what remained of it, participated in these battles, holding ground briefly, then falling back, then standing again, in a pattern that would repeat until the division was finally reduced to tactical irrelevance. Consider for a moment the transformation that had occurred. The division that had been meticulously formed and trained in France in 1943, that had been proudly named after a medieval dynasty, had now become something quite different. It was a remnant, composed of survivors of multiple campaigns and replacements who had never served with the division before, united only by their military designation and their orders. The cohesion, the esprit de corps, the sense of unit identity that had held such formations together in earlier campaigns, was fragmenting under the weight of continuous combat and constant losses. Throughout February and March of 1945, the Hohenstaufen Division continued to fight a retreating war across what remained of German-controlled territory in the east. The Soviet advance was inexorable. Cities that had once seemed secure, Warsaw, Krakow, Breslau, fell one by one. The division fell back with the lines, sometimes gaining a respite of a few days, more often engaged in continuous contact with Soviet forces. The men who remained, those who had survived Tarnopol and Normandy and Arnhem and the Ardennes, now faced the knowledge that the war could not be won, that the end was approaching, that the homeland was being invaded. What kept soldiers fighting at this point? It was partly habit, partly discipline, partly fear of what would happen if they surrendered or deserted. For those in the Waffen-SS, particularly, there was also the knowledge that as members of what the Allies considered a criminal organization, capture might mean trial and execution. This grim calculus, playing out in the minds of thousands of men, meant that fighting continued even when hope had evaporated. The Hohenstaufen Division, by the time it was withdrawn from the Eastern Front sometime in late March or early April of 1945, had been reduced to a shadow of its former strength. Exact numbers are difficult to determine from surviving records, but it is estimated that the division possessed perhaps 30 or 40 functioning tanks, down from hundreds at the beginning of the war, and a few thousand men under arms, drawn from a formation that had once fielded nearly 20,000. The rest were dead, wounded, captured, or dispersed beyond recovery. Would you have recognized this formation as the same unit that had fought with distinction at Arnhem? Likely not. It was, in essence, a name on a roster, a designation on a map, a symbol with little substance remaining. In those final weeks of the war, as the division was pulled back once more toward the collapsing center of the Reich, there would be one final act, one more chapter in the long diminishment. But the momentum had long since ceased to exist. The great machinery of German armored warfare, which had once possessed the power to shape the course of entire campaigns, had been reduced to the futile gestures of the dying. The winter of 1944 and into the early months of 1945 found the 9th SS Panzer Division Hohenstaufen in a state of profound transformation, though transformation might be a generous word for what was truly a slow, inevitable unraveling. After the grinding campaigns in the west, after Normandy and the desperate fighting around Arnhem, the division had been withdrawn once more to refit and reconstitute its shattered ranks. But the Germany they returned to was no longer the nation that had launched Operation Barbarossa with such overwhelming confidence. The Reich was contracting. The Soviets had pushed steadily westward through the winter, and the Americans and British were preparing for their crossing of the Rhine. Hohenstaufen found itself pulled eastward again, toward Hungary, toward Austria, toward the crumbling periphery of a dying state. By early 1945, the division's strength had dwindled to perhaps half what it had been when it first formed in 1943. The perpetual drain of casualties, the losses that could not be replaced, the steady attrition of experienced soldiers and officers, all of this had accumulated into a kind of exhaustion that no amount of fresh recruits could quite restore. The men who remained were hardened, yes, but they were also deeply weary. Many had now seen years of combat. They had survived the Eastern Front's immensity, the Western campaign's intensity, and the peculiar horror of urban fighting in places like Arnhem. What remained of their cohesion was remarkable, even as the larger structure of the German military command was fragmenting around them. The Hungarian campaign presented conditions unlike anything the division had previously encountered. The terrain was different from the vast steppes of Ukraine or the bocage of Normandy. Here were hills, river valleys, towns nestled into complicated topography. The weather that winter was brutal, snow and ice interspersed with thaws that turned roads into streams of mud. Supply lines stretched thin across territory that was increasingly contested, and the Soviets, for their part, were pressing with relentless momentum toward Budapest, toward Vienna, toward the heart of what remained of German-controlled Europe. Hohenstaufen was committed to defensive operations, attempting to hold positions against the advancing Red Army, but the very concept of a fixed line was becoming almost meaningless. The Soviets, having learned from their own costly experiences, were now executing encirclement operations with devastating precision and speed. A division would be assigned a sector to hold, and within days the Russians would have probed its flanks, broken through a weak point, and begun the process of surrounding it. The response was always the same: attempt to break out, attempt to regroup, attempt to establish another line farther back. And each time, the division was a little smaller, a little more depleted. What happened to Hohenstaufen during these months was not unique to this particular formation. It was the fate of nearly all German divisions on the Eastern Front in 1945. But it is worth lingering on the human dimension of this collapse. Consider the young Panzer crewmen who had joined the division in 1943, full of whatever ideological fervor or simple patriotic duty had motivated them. They had survived years of war. They had seen friends die. And now, in the closing months, they faced the knowledge that the war was lost. This realization did not come all at once, but rather in accumulating evidence: the endless stream of retreat orders, the Soviet advances that no counterattack could stop, the absence now of the Luftwaffe, which had once provided at least the illusion of air cover. The question that must have haunted many of these men is one that historians can only glimpse obliquely through memoirs and post-war interviews. When you know the cause is lost, when you know that your nation is being defeated, what keeps you fighting? The answers were varied and complex. Some fought from habit, from the bonds of unit cohesion, from the simple fact that stopping fighting often meant death more certainly than continuing it did. Some still harbored hopes for a miracle, a new weapon, a split between the Allies, some turn in fortune that might yet reverse the tide. Others, particularly the Nazi Party ideologues and SS officers embedded in the unit structure, fought from conviction, unwilling to accept the ideological and political death that surrender would represent. And some, perhaps, fought simply because fighting was all they knew anymore. The Austrian and Hungarian campaigns saw Hohenstaufen engaged in a series of battles that are less well known than the famous engagements of earlier years, and yet they were no less bitter or costly. The division fought near Lake Balaton, fought in the hills around Budapest, fought in the valley approaches to Vienna. Each battle followed a similar pattern: initial defensive positions, Soviet probing attacks, eventual breakthrough, desperate counterattacks that sometimes recaptured lost ground temporarily, and then another order to fall back. The winter and early spring weather made conditions miserable. Supply issues grew worse. Men died not only in combat but from exposure, from disease, from the simple privation of war in its final, chaotic phase. One particular engagement, sometimes referred to as the Lake Balaton counteroffensive or the Unternehmen Frühlingserwachen, Operation Spring Awakening, represented perhaps the last large-scale German attempt at an offensive on the Eastern Front. In March 1945, the Hohenstaufen Division was among several panzer formations committed to a major assault designed to recapture Hungarian territory and relieve the beleaguered garrison in Budapest. For a brief moment, there was something almost like the old German military optimism. Panzer divisions were committed in strength. Careful planning went into the operation, and initially, the attack made progress against Soviet positions. But the Soviets had anticipated the offensive, or at least prepared for it. The Red Army had learned to prepare for German counterattacks in ways that made them devastatingly costly to execute. Anti-tank defenses were laid out in depth. Reserves were positioned to contain any breakthrough. When Hohenstaufen and its sister formations attacked, they did inflict damage. They did force the Soviets to fight hard for their positions, but they could not achieve a decisive breakthrough. The attack stalled after a few days of fighting. The panzer reserves were depleted, and the Soviet response came swiftly. Encirclement of the German spearhead, threats to its flanks and rear, the familiar Soviet maneuver that had spelled doom to so many German formations. By this point, Hohenstaufen was fighting with perhaps 30% of its original strength, and that figure might be generous. The equipment situation was dire. Tank losses could barely be replaced. The division did possess some of the newer Panther tanks and even a few Tigers, but these were scattered among the ranks and often operated without adequate fuel or ammunition. The infrastructure that had once sustained the Wehrmacht was breaking down. Trains could not run on schedule. Roads were either controlled by the Soviets or constantly threatened. Desertion became an increasing problem. Though the SS maintained harsh discipline, men who attempted to flee the division could expect summary execution, and this penalty was apparently carried out with some regularity, though the exact extent remains obscured by time and the destruction of records. What emerges from accounts of this period is a portrait of disintegration that occurred in slow motion, unit by unit, sometimes man by man. The division as a cohesive fighting formation was ceasing to exist. Officers found themselves commanding not divisions or even regiments, but ad hoc battle groups, formed from whatever units were present and functioning at any given moment. Maps became less reliable as the front shifted constantly. Communications between units broke down. The grand organizational structure that had once organized German military power into neat formations with clear lines of authority was collapsing into a kind of chaos held together only by the personal authority of individual commanders and the dwindling military culture of discipline. By late April 1945, as Soviet forces pushed deeper into Austria, as American forces approached from the west, Hohenstaufen found itself in the territory of Austria itself, perhaps a few hundred kilometers from where the division had been formed nearly 2 years earlier. The war was clearly in its final days. The Soviets had captured Budapest. Berlin itself was under siege. Hitler had retreated to his bunker, and yet the division, or what remained of it, was still fighting. One might wonder why. The rational calculation would have been that surrender was now not merely inevitable, but also more merciful than continued resistance. And yet some formations continued to fight, either because their commanders ordered them to, or because they had nowhere else to go, or because the machinery of the state, even as it was collapsing, could still compel obedience through fear. The final days of the division's existence as a fighting force are difficult to reconstruct in detail, in part because records were destroyed, in part because survivors had varying accounts of what occurred, and in part because the very concept of a unified division command was already questionable by this point. What seems to have happened is that the remaining elements of Hohenstaufen, scattered across Austrian territory, gradually lost contact with higher command. Some units surrendered to Soviet forces and were captured. Some moved westward in the hope of surrendering to American or British forces, who might offer less harsh treatment than they could expect from the Red Army. Some units simply dissolved, with men discarding uniforms and attempting to survive in the chaos of occupied territory. And some pockets of resistance, whether from fanatical SS officers or simply from units that had lost all coherent command structure, continued to fight in isolated engagements even after the broader German surrender on May 7, 1945. The human cost of these final battles, and of this final dissolution, is difficult to quantify with precision. The losses Hohenstaufen sustained from late 1944 onward were in the hundreds per month, sometimes far higher after major engagements. Killed, wounded, captured, missing. The division that had been created with such care and ideological purpose in 1943 was scattered into these categories over the span of less than 2 years of major warfare. The survivors, those who made it through the Hungarian and Austrian campaigns alive, faced an uncertain future. Some would be captured by Soviet forces and spend years in Soviet POW camps, facing interrogation and hardship. Others would be captured by Western forces and eventually released or tried for war crimes. Still others would manage to simply disappear into the civilian population and attempt to rebuild lives in a defeated, occupied nation. It is perhaps a reflective observation that the disintegration of Hohenstaufen in these final months was not accompanied by dramatic last stands or heroic final battles. There were no famous final orders, no legendary last defenses of crucial positions that would echo through history. Instead, there was simply the slow, grinding dissolution of a military formation, the reduction of manpower, the loss of equipment, the breakdown of command authority, the slow erosion of fighting. When the war ended in May of 1945, the 9th SS Panzer Division Hohenstaufen ceased to exist as a fighting force. The units that remained, scattered across the Austrian and Czech territories in the war's final chaos, surrendered to whichever Allied army reached them first. The men who had survived the Eastern Front, Normandy, Arnhem, and the Ardennes, filed into prisoner-of-war camps, many expecting that capture meant safety, at last, from the grinding machinery of combat. But for many in the Waffen-SS, the war's end was not an ending. It was a threshold into reckoning. The investigation into German war crimes began even before the war itself concluded. Allied intelligence services, aware of atrocities committed across occupied Europe, had begun compiling evidence, recording testimony, photographing destroyed villages. When the camps were liberated, Auschwitz, Dachau, Buchenwald, and so many others, the documentary evidence of systematic genocide became undeniable. The Waffen-SS, though it was a military organization rather than a police force, could not claim innocence. Units bearing the SS runes had participated in mass shootings on the Eastern Front. They had guarded concentration camps. They had been present at massacres, or had committed them themselves. The question of what exactly the 9th SS Panzer Division Hohenstaufen was responsible for became one thread in a much larger and more terrible tapestry. The division itself, as a panzer formation, had been committed primarily to conventional combat. Its role was to fight tanks and infantry in pitched battles. It was not, as far as surviving documentation suggests, directly involved in the industrial genocide conducted in the camps. Yet the Waffen-SS as a whole carried a collective stain that could not be easily separated from individual units. The very fact of wearing the runes meant complicity in a system that committed crimes beyond measure. In the years immediately following surrender, the Allies faced a practical problem. There were hundreds of thousands of German prisoners to detain, interrogate, prosecute, and eventually release. The Nuremberg trials, which began in November of 1945, focused on the highest echelons of Nazi leadership. The proceedings were meticulous and historically unprecedented, a formal international effort to establish that systematic criminality had occurred and to assign responsibility. Yet Nuremberg, for all its weight and importance, could not address every soldier, every unit, every act. For the men of Hohenstaufen, the immediate post-war period was uncertain. Some were detained in British prisoner camps, some in American facilities. Many were interrogated, not primarily about war crimes but about their service, their equipment, their movements during the campaign in the West. Allied military intelligence was interested in operational details, how panzer divisions functioned, where supplies came from, who commanded what. The larger reckoning came slowly, and for many soldiers, it never came at all. There were, however, specific allegations and investigations. The Waffen-SS had committed atrocities. That much was established beyond doubt. But determining which units, which officers, which individual soldiers bore direct responsibility required investigation. Some men who had worn the SS uniform were indeed prosecuted. Officers and senior non-commissioned officers faced greater scrutiny than conscripted soldiers. Yet the distinction between voluntary membership and conscription, between knowledge and complicity, became murky in the courtroom. How much did a young tank driver know about what the SS as an institution was doing? How culpable was he? These questions remain contested by historians to this day. What emerged from the post-war investigations was a clearer but still incomplete picture. The 9th SS Panzer Division Hohenstaufen, as an operational panzer unit, had not run extermination camps. Its soldiers, as far as documented evidence shows, had not participated in the mechanized murder that defined the Holocaust. Yet the unit existed within and was sustained by a system that did. Officers who commanded Hohenstaufen had sworn allegiance to Hitler. The men wore insignia that represented an ideological project of racial domination. And in the grinding reality of the Eastern Front, soldiers of the Waffen-SS, including, likely, some in Hohenstaufen, had participated in mass executions of prisoners, of Jews, of Soviet civilians deemed dangerous to the occupation. The historical memory of Hohenstaufen became entangled with these larger questions. In the Cold War decades, West Germany sought to rebuild. There was no appetite in Western Allied capitals for endless recriminations against German soldiers. Many men from Hohenstaufen lived out their post-war lives in relative quiet, their wartime service neither forgotten nor relentlessly prosecuted. Some spoke candidly about their experiences, others were silent. A few were prosecuted decades later when new evidence emerged, but most passed into ordinary civilian existence. The scholarly reckoning came later. Military historians studied Hohenstaufen's actions at Arnhem with detailed precision, examining orders, analyzing tactics, noting the professionalism and discipline evident in the German defense. Yet alongside this military analysis lay another, sadder historical project, documenting the crimes of the Waffen-SS as an institution. Researchers noted that Hohenstaufen, having been formed late in the war and composed of conscripts and new volunteers, was somewhat different from the earliest SS divisions, which had been volunteer-based and more deeply ideologically committed. Does this distinction matter? It is a question historians still gently debate. The honest truth is that Hohenstaufen's legacy cannot be cleanly separated from the moral catastrophe that was the Third Reich and its crimes. The division fought battles with skill and courage. These facts are historical record. The men within it endured hardship, cold, hunger, and death. This too is true. Yet all of it occurred in service to a regime that murdered millions, that sought to exterminate entire peoples, that created a continental empire of concentration camps and death. No amount of military competence or battlefield valor erases that context. In modern Germany, the way Hohenstaufen is remembered reflects a broader national struggle with how to regard the Wehrmacht and the Waffen-SS. Some remember them as soldiers who were caught up in terrible times, who were conscripted or pressured into service, who fought and died like soldiers everywhere. Others insist that this narrative of victimhood obscures agency and complicity. There is truth in both perspectives, though they sit uncomfortably together. A conscript who was drafted is not the same as a volunteer who joined the SS because he believed in its ideals. Yet the victim of a German bullet does not care much about the distinctions between types of German soldier. What remains, now more than 80 years after the end of the war, is a historical record that is both detailed and incomplete. We know what Hohenstaufen did in battle. We know less about what individual soldiers knew, believed, did when they were not fighting. We have the papers, the maps, the orders, the photographs. We have testimony from survivors, from British soldiers, from Dutch civilians, from German soldiers themselves. Yet something always escapes the historical net: the interior thoughts of a man firing a tank gun, the private doubts of an officer, the silent awareness or ignorance of soldiers riding in trucks through occupied territory. These remain, ultimately, beyond our full reach. The division's legacy, then, is ambiguous and troubling. It was operationally competent. It was not responsible for the industrial genocide, as far as we know. Yet, it was part of the machinery that enabled that genocide. It existed because of the regime that committed those crimes. Its soldiers benefited from the plunder and the labor of those whom the regime murdered. And like so much of the German military in this period, it cannot be understood apart from the broader context of Nazi criminality, even when its own immediate actions were those of a conventional military force. In the years after the war, some men from Hohenstaufen spoke to historians. Some wrote memoirs. A few were interviewed for documentary purposes. What emerges from these accounts is a familiar human pattern: men doing their duty, obeying orders, trying to survive, often not thinking too deeply about the larger context. This is not an excuse. It is an observation about how ordinary human beings behave when caught in extraordinary circumstances. It is also, perhaps, why the history of this period remains so morally necessary to study. These were not monsters. They were not uniquely evil. They were men, and that is precisely what makes their story so unsettling. It suggests that under the right pressures, with the right propaganda, with the right combination of fear and ideology and proximity to power, ordinary men will participate in or tolerate extraordinary evil. The memory of Hohenstaufen in the present day is therefore not a simple matter of celebrating military achievement or condemning war criminals. It is a more complex task, holding both realities in mind simultaneously, acknowledging that the soldiers were human beings, many of whom showed courage and competence, and acknowledging that they served a regime whose criminality was absolute and unprecedented. This balance is uncomfortable. Perhaps it should be. A history that is too comfortable with itself is a history that has not truly reckoned with what it is studying. If you were to walk through Arnhem and Oosterbeek today, the towns would feel almost impossibly ordinary to you. The September air still carries that particular quality of light that made those fields seem golden even in 1944, and the Rhine still flows with the same patient rhythm it did 80 years ago. The streets have been rebuilt, the rubble cleared, the deep gouges of war filled in with new brick and careful restoration. Yet if you know where to look, and there are those who have made it their careful work to mark these places, you can still find the landscape embedded with memory. There are memorial stones set into sidewalks near the bridge, small bronze plaques that catch the light and tell the names of those who fell in those first desperate days of the operation. Oosterbeek, a few kilometers north, has become almost a pilgrimage site of quiet reflection. The Airborne Museum stands there now, housed partly in the Hotel Hartenstein, the very building where British paratroopers made their final defensive stand. The gardens around it are planted with care, and visitors walk through them with the kind of reverence that seems to settle naturally into the bones when you stand in a place where so many people died. It is curious, perhaps, how a landscape retains no visible scar after enough time has passed. The trees have grown back fuller. The farmhouses that were pockmarked with bullets have been repaired or rebuilt. Yet something seems to linger in the quietness of these places, in the way the wind moves through the trees, in the quality of the light as it falls across a field where armored vehicles once churned the earth to mud and ash. The memory lives not in the ground itself, but in the act of choosing to remember it. The Hohenstaufen Division, like so many of the units that fought in those battles, exists now only in records and testimony and the careful research of historians who came long after. The men who wore its insignia are nearly all gone. Some survived the war and returned to ordinary lives, carrying the weight of what they had seen and done. Others died in the endless grinding of battle after battle, their names recorded in meticulously kept German military archives that survived the war's end. Others still vanished into the chaos of the Eastern Front's final collapse, their fates unknown or lost to time. When you visit the cemeteries where soldiers from all sides were buried, and there are several in the region, some for British and Polish dead, others for German, you encounter a strange and affecting equalization. The headstones are marked with names and dates, and sometimes a simple prayer or epitaph. A young man from Yorkshire lies a few meters from a young man from Berlin. Neither one, as you stand between their graves, seems more or less worthy of memory. Both are gone. Both left people behind who mourned them. The specific cause they fought for, the ideology they carried or were forced to carry, the uniform they wore, all of it recedes when you confront the simple fact of their absence. This is perhaps the strangest and most important function of memorial landscapes. They do not resolve the moral complexities of history. They do not absolve anyone or anything. Rather, they create a kind of space where those complexities can coexist without being erased. You can honor the courage and sacrifice of the British and Polish paratroopers without diminishing the tragic waste of German soldiers, many of them conscripts or young believers in a cause they would later reject. You can study the Waffen-SS with clear historical eyes, understanding it as a criminal organization, documenting its atrocities, holding it accountable, while also acknowledging that individual soldiers within it were sometimes fighting not for ideology, but for survival, for loyalty to their comrades, for the simple human instinct to stay alive another day. The question of how memory should be held in landscapes like Arnhem is not one with a simple answer. It requires constant, gentle attention. It requires people willing to walk through those towns and stand in those cemeteries and ask themselves difficult questions. What happened here? Who were the people who lived through it? What choices did they face? What could they have done differently? And what was simply beyond their power to change? These are not questions meant to be answered quickly or conclusively. They are questions meant to be sat with, turned over slowly, reconsidered as new evidence emerges, and new perspectives are added to the historical record. The Airborne Museum in Oosterbeek displays uniforms and weapons, and letters and photographs from the battle. It also, in its quieter sections, displays information about the German units that fought there, including the Hohenstaufen. This too is a kind of memorial, not to glorify those units, but to insist that history include them, that we understand who they were and what they did, that we resist the simplification of the past into simple stories of good and evil. The real history is far more layered and troubling and human than that. If you were to walk through those towns in the soft light of an autumn evening, watching the way the sky turns from gold to pale blue to violet, you might find yourself thinking about time itself. 80 years is a long time in the life of a human being. It is nothing in the life of a landscape. The Rhine is older than any of us, older than nations, older than ideologies. It will be there long after everyone alive today has died. In its way, that is a consoling thought, not because it diminishes the importance of what happened during those few days in September 1944, but because it places those days within a longer continuity of time, a reminder that the brief moment of catastrophe is also, inevitably, passing. The memorials in Arnhem and Oosterbeek are not monuments in the grand sense. They are not built to triumph or vindication. They are built to bearing witness, to saying, "This happened here. These people lived and died. We will not forget." This act of witness seems to be something humans need to do, especially in places where great suffering occurred. It is not enough to read about it in books or watch it in films. We need to stand in the actual place, to feel the actual air, to let our imagination move across the actual ground where history unfolded. There is a peace that comes to such places after enough time has passed. Not the peace of forgetting. Forgetting would be a kind of betrayal of those who died. Rather, the peace of integration. The violence and chaos